He took the microphone at their wedding and told 200 people she was too fat to love. He smiled while he did it. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She pulled the ring from her finger, let it hit the marble floor, and walked out into the rain alone, with nothing but the wreckage of a white dress and a spine made of something he never bothered to understand. That night, a man more dangerous than anyone in that ballroom opened a car door and offered her something no one ever had. A choice. This is the story of what she did with it. If this story hits you somewhere real, like the video, drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this one travels. The dress had cost $4,000. Maribel Quince had not wanted to spend $4,000 on a dress. She had argued about it with her mother for 3 weeks, standing in the narrow dressing room of Bridal Atelier Crestwood, while her mother pressed a hand to her mouth and said things like, "You'll regret not doing this right, and this is the one day that matters." Maribel had looked at herself in the mirror, the full-length, brutally honest mirror that bridal shops favored, as if exposing every roll and curve was part of the service. And she had thought, this dress does not know what to do with me. The fabric bunched wrong at her hips. The lace gaped at the back where the seamstress had let out the seams twice already, and still it pulled. Her arms were bare, and she hated her arms bare. Had spent 31 years developing a sophisticated architecture of cardigans and strategic angles to deal with that particular problem. And now here she was, bare-armed and exposed in $4,000 worth of ivory satin, trying to convince herself that the woman in the mirror looked like someone's bride. Her mother had cried. Good tears, supposedly. The kind that meant, yes, yes, this is the one. Maribel had paid for the dress. Now she stood at the entrance to the Grand Aurelia Hotel ballroom, and the dress felt like a decision she could no longer afford. The chandelier overhead was the kind of fixture that existed solely to make everything below it look important. Crystal arms spreading out like a frozen explosion, throwing light in every direction with the democratic cruelty of a spotlight. It caught the room's 200 guests, the silk lapels, the diamond earrings, the careful blowouts, and it caught Maribel, too, and it did not care which of these things was worth illuminating. She had arrived at this moment through a corridor of 31 years and a 5-year relationship with Preston Vale, and standing here now, gripping her bouquet of ivory peonies so hard the stems were bending, she could feel the whole weight of it pressing down through her heeled shoes and into the marble floor. Preston was already at the altar. He was wearing a gray suit she had helped pick out, slim cut, good shoulders, the kind of suit that made people glance at a man twice. His hair was swept back. He was smiling at something one of his groomsmen had just said, and the smile was easy and practiced and familiar. She had watched him produce that smile at 100 dinners, 100 events, the smile of a man who understood how to be seen. She did not know, in that moment, that the smile had nothing to do with her. The string quartet changed their piece. That was the signal. Maribel felt her mother touch her arm and say something she didn't catch. And then her feet were moving across the marble, and the guests were turning toward her, all those faces rotating in her direction, and she was walking down the aisle of the Grand Aurelia Hotel in a dress that cost $4,000, and she was thinking, absurdly, about the seamstress who had let out the seams, about the woman's careful hands and the pins in her mouth, and the way she had said there, "That's better," with such specific professional kindness, as if she understood that she was performing a small mercy. Preston watched her come toward him. She couldn't read his face from this distance. She never entirely could. That was something she had filed away and never fully examined. The fact that after 5 years she still sometimes couldn't tell what he was thinking when he looked at her. She reached the altar. He took her hands. His palms were dry. Hers weren't. The officiant, a man with a white beard and an authoritative posture, opened with the expected words, the language of occasion, of ritual, of this significant day. Maribel listened and tried to be present for it. She was good at that, generally. Being present, showing up. It was something she'd had to build deliberately, the habit of staying in the room when instinct told her to find an exit, and she'd gotten competent at it, if not entirely comfortable. Preston's hands were still dry. She noticed that his eyes had moved off her face, not toward the officiant, not toward the guests, just off. Somewhere to the middle distance, the practiced unfocusing of a man working something out. The officiant reached the point in the ceremony where he asked if anyone had reason to object. And it was the ancient formality, the relic that no one actually used, And Maribel had thought about it before the way you think about the safety instructions on an airplane, dutifully, briefly, without genuine expectation of relevance. Preston cleared his throat. It was a small sound, modest even, apologetic in its way. The officiant paused. Actually, Preston said, I need a moment. I'm sorry. I need to say something. The officiant blinked. The string quartet, sensing something, tapered into silence. Maribel's hands went cold. Preston. Her voice was low. She meant it as a warning. She could hear from somewhere in the back of her skull a sound like something beginning to break. Not dramatic, not sudden, the way glass breaks when a crack has been traveling through it for longer than anyone noticed. He let go of her hands. He actually let go of her hands, and he stepped back a half step, and someone in the audience made a soft sound of confusion. Preston ran a hand through his carefully swept hair and looked at her with an expression she recognized. Finally, relief. He looked relieved. The way a man looks when he has been carrying something heavy for too long and has finally decided to set it down, regardless of where that leaves the thing he was carrying. He reached past her, toward the small table where the event coordinator had placed the ceremony program and the unity candle, and he picked up the cordless microphone that had been placed there for the vows. Maribel understood then. Before he said a word, she understood. I've been trying to figure out how to do this the right way, Preston said into the microphone. His voice filled the ballroom, clear and amplified and terrible. And there isn't a right way. I know that. I'm not. He stopped, recalibrated, looked out at the guests instead of at her. Maribel and I have been together for 5 years, and I care about her. I do. That's real. Silence so complete she could hear the chandelier's electricity hum. But I can't do this, he said. I can't stand here and make a promise I know I can't keep. And I've been watching her this past year, and I think she deserves honesty more than she deserves this. He gestured vaguely at the altar, the flowers, the room. Preston, her voice was still low, still controlled. The cracking sound in her head had stopped, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous. The sound of a decision being made. I can't marry a woman who has, he paused, actually paused to choose his words, who has let herself become too much. I know how that sounds. I know. But I have to stand in front of our family, our friends, and the people I work with, and another pause. I can't be the man I need to be with someone who... Stop, she said. He kept going. She stopped hearing the words exactly. They came to her in fragments, who I'm attracted to, and it's not what I imagined, and she knows I've tried to talk about this before. And each fragment was a stone, and the stones were building something, and the something they were building was a wall between the woman she had been at 9 o'clock this morning and whoever she was going to be for the rest of her life. 200 people were watching. She knew this. She was acutely aware of it, the way you're aware of cold water closing over your head. Total body knowledge. No room for abstraction. 200 people, many of whom had watched her grow up, some of whom had made the same quiet jokes Preston was now making publicly, all of whom were watching her receive this in real time. She looked at Preston. He had stopped talking. He was looking at her now, finally, with that relief still resident in his face, and underneath the relief something else, something that expected her to cry, she thought. That had planned on her crying. That had probably rehearsed some version of I'm sorry calibrated to the exact temperature of her tears. She was not going to cry. She looked down at her left hand. The engagement ring was a round-cut diamond in a platinum band, selected after several visits to 3 different jewelers, and she had loved it the way she'd loved the dress, with a love that was really a hope that the object could anchor something that needed anchoring. She worked the ring off her finger. The room was so quiet she heard it clearly, the small, bright sound of a diamond ring striking Italian marble. It hit and skipped twice and came to rest somewhere near Preston's shoe. He looked down at it. She looked at him. We're done, she said. Not into a microphone, just at him, at the distance of 2 feet at normal speaking volume. Don't call me. Then she turned and walked back up the aisle. The 200 guests parted, not quickly. There was a beat of frozen stupefaction first, the collective paralysis of people trying to process something outside their prepared categories. Then they moved, and Maribel Quince walked through the Grand Aurelia Hotel ballroom in her $4,000 dress, bouquet still in hand because she hadn't thought to put it down, and she kept her shoulders back and her chin level and her eyes forward. She heard someone start to say her name. Her mother, probably. She did not slow down. She pushed through the ballroom doors. The corridor outside was carpeted and dim after the chandelier's assault, and she moved through it quickly, past a confused hotel employee and a cart of champagne glasses waiting to be deployed at the reception that would not be happening, and she hit the heavy front door and shoved it open, and the night air came at her like a fist. Rain. Not a gentle rain. A late autumn, serious rain, the kind that had been building pressure all day, that fell in sheets and immediately found the gap between her upswept hair and the back of her neck. The valets under their covered stand were staring. The black-suited doorman started to move toward her with an umbrella. She waved him off. She stood on the top step of the Grand Aurelia Hotel in the rain, in her ruined dress, and she breathed. Her hands were shaking. She realized this the way you realize something you've been feeling for a while, says, not suddenly, but with a kind of arriving acknowledgement. The bouquet dropped from her fingers, and the peonies scattered across the wet steps, and she let them go. Her bare arms were soaked. The dress was drinking water from every angle. She had stopped caring about the dress approximately 30 seconds into Preston Vale's microphone performance. She needed to move. She knew that. She needed a plan, a direction, a next thing. But the next thing would not come. Her mind was producing nothing useful, only a kind of white noise overlaid with fragments of his voice. Too much. The phrase had a specific weight to it. Not just tonight, it was the accumulated weight of every moment she'd spent making herself smaller, taking up less space at the table, ordering less food than she wanted because he was watching, skipping the swimsuit at his company retreat, choosing the cardigan, choosing the angle, choosing the version of herself that might be enough. She had spent 5 years trying not to be too much. She'd done it badly, apparently. A car pulled up to the curb. Not a cab. The wrong shape for that, and too quiet. A black armored sedan, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most people's annual salary, with windows dark enough that the rain bounced off them like they were solid. It moved with that specific unhurried speed that belongs to machines and people that have never had to rush, that have never had to be anywhere by a deadline set by someone else. It stopped directly in front of her. She stared at it. The driver did not get out. Nobody rushed to open doors. The car simply sat there, engine running, in the rain, as if it had been expecting her. Then the back window descended 4 inches. "You dropped your flowers." The voice that came through the gap was low and uninflected and carried the kind of controlled quality that has to be learned, that is not natural to anyone, but is instead constructed piece by piece over years of deciding exactly how much to show. "You should come out of the rain." She could see almost nothing through the gap. A shape, mostly. A man's face in shadow, the light catching the line of a jaw, the edge of a watchband. "I don't know you," she said. "No," the voice agreed. She looked back at the hotel doors. Through the glass she could see movement. Guests beginning to drift into the corridor, some turning their faces toward the entrance, and there was her mother's silhouette, small and urgent, moving toward the door. The sedan window dropped another inch. "Maribel Quince," the voice said. Not as a question, as a statement of something already known. She turned back to the car. "You know my name. I know a lot of things about the man who just made a speech in there." A pause, long enough to mean something. "Come out of the rain. I'll explain." The hotel doors were opening behind her. She heard her mother's voice, high and carrying. "Maribel, wait, wait." And she heard other voices too, and she could feel the shape of what the next 20 minutes would look like if she stayed, the flooding sympathy and the careful faces, the phone calls that would be made, the way this night would become a story that happened to her, a story about her body and its failures, a story that would follow her into every room she entered for the next decade. She looked at the car. She walked down the steps, stepped over the scattered peonies, and got in. The door closed with the weighted silence of a vault. The interior was black leather and controlled temperature and a quiet so different from the outside noise that it felt almost pressurized. There was a glass of water in the cup holder nearest her. The rain against the windows was immediately remote. He was sitting on the far side of the back seat. She could see him now, Her eyes adjusted, and she took him in the way you take in something you know you should be afraid of, cataloging efficiently. 40, maybe 42. Built less like someone who went to a gym and more like someone whose job had shaped his body over years without his permission. Dark suit, no tie, collar button open. His face was angular and weathered in a way that was not quite handsome and not quite the opposite. Striking was the word that surfaced, the way a particular stretch of empty highway is striking, the kind that makes you drive faster. He was watching her with the expression of a man waiting for a reaction to land. Cassian Vey, he said. The name registered. She wasn't a fool. She read the news. She paid attention. And that name had been in the news often enough that even people who didn't track organized crime in this city knew it the way they knew about storms, peripherally, as a category of weather. The Vey network was what people meant when they talked about the city's other architecture, the infrastructure that ran beneath the visible one, the one without press releases. You're the... She stopped. Started again. You run the... Yes, he said. She absorbed this. The rain was sliding down the windows. Through the dark glass, the Grand Aurelia's entrance was already receding. The driver had pulled away while she was still orienting herself, smooth and quiet and without asking. Why do you know my name? She said. Because I've been watching Preston Vale's business for 2 months. He reached toward the center console, picked up a glass of something amber, and considered it without drinking. He has bad habits, the kind that are useful to me. That has nothing to do with me. It does now. He looked at her directly for the first time, the steady, appraising kind of look that most people avoided because it required acknowledging that they were looking. He's been selling information about his employer, about clients. Small things at first. He's careful, but not careful enough. She was cold, she realized. The dress was soaked through and the car's climate control was not compensating for wet ivory satin. She crossed her arms, which did nothing useful, but was something to do with her body. Why are you telling me this? Because I need something, and you're in a position where you might need something too. He finally took a drink, set the glass back down. I need a wife. She stared at him. He held up one hand, a gesture that was not quite a request for patience and not quite a command, something in between. Not the way that sounds. I need the optics of a stable marriage. I have a board meeting in 3 weeks with investors who have been watching my personal life for vulnerabilities. They're not wrong to look. An unmarried man in my position is a target in specific ways that are complicated to explain and not worth explaining. I need someone with credibility in certain social circles, someone who is not afraid of difficult rooms. What? You want to use me? I want to offer you a contract, he said. There's a difference. You would have security, resources, and whatever you need to start over from tonight. He paused. In return, you appear with me publicly, you conduct yourself as my wife in professional contexts, and you ask me nothing about the parts of my business that don't concern you. She looked at him. The car hummed. The rain came down. That's insane, she said. Yes, he said, unconcerned. I don't know you. I was getting married an hour ago. I'm wearing a wet wedding dress. I know. What makes you think I would... Because, he said, and his voice dropped half a register, not softer but slower, more precise. I watched you walk out of that room. I watched you stand in the rain, and I watched you make a decision. He looked at her steadily. That's not someone who does things out of desperation. That's someone who knows that the next move has to count. I'm offering you a next move. The car had merged onto the elevated highway now, the city spreading out below in its wet, illuminated grid, and Maribel Quince sat in the back of an armored sedan in a ruined wedding dress and looked at the man who had made her an offer that should have been impossible to consider, and she considered it. Not because she was desperate. He was right about that much. She had never in her life made a decision from pure desperation, had always found, in the worst moments, that cold specific slot where reason still operated. She considered it because Preston's voice was still in her ear, the microphone amplifying it to fill every inch of a ballroom, and the woman who had stood there receiving that was already a former self, already receding, and the only question now was what the next self looked like. I want a lawyer, she said, an independent one, Not yours. Something moved in Cassian Vey's expression. Not warmth, but something that had been waiting for exactly that answer. I know 3, he said. You can pick. She turned back to the window. The city moved beneath them. Somewhere below, she knew the Grand Aurelia Hotel was still full of guests in their careful clothes, and Preston Vale was still standing at an altar where a diamond ring had just been returned to him in the only way it deserved to be. And her mother was probably crying, and in the morning the photographs would be wrong, and everything about the last 5 years would need to be recalculated. She breathed. The heater had finally reached her. She was still cold, but less cold. Tell me about the contract, she said. The Vey estate sat at the end of a private road off the North Shore Parkway, behind gates that were not decorative. Maribel had read about it once in a feature piece about the city's significant private properties. A 1920s Georgian revival that had been renovated twice, 16 rooms, grounds that backed up against a sound. The article had a photograph of the exterior, and Maribel had looked at it with the casual awareness you give to things that exist in a different category of life than yours. Now she was standing inside it. Cassian's associate, a compact, precise man named Drum, who had said approximately 9 words since collecting her bag from the sedan, led her through a marble-floored entry hall and up a staircase that managed to be grand without performing grandeur, if that was possible, and delivered her to a bedroom at the end of the second-floor corridor that was larger than the apartment she'd shared with Preston. It was also, she noticed immediately, entirely separate from any space that appeared to belong to Cassian Vey. The room was furnished in dark wood and gray linen, with a fireplace that had been lit in advance, and a closet that had been stocked with clothes. She stood in front of the open closet for a long moment. The clothes were correct, not in a creepy, specific way, but in the general way of someone who had a reasonable estimate of her size and had acquired a range of things accordingly. Functional clothes, mostly. A few things that were clearly intended for the kind of social events she supposed she'd be attending. No apology in the cut of them, nothing selected to hide. She sat on the edge of the bed. The fire was doing its work, and the room was warm, and outside the rain was still coming down, and she was exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical. The exhaustion of a day that had consumed 3 different versions of who she thought she was going to be by tomorrow morning. A knock at the door. Come in. It was a woman. 50s, sturdy, with the bearing of someone who had been running a household professionally for decades and had developed, as a result, a particular kind of unimpressible competence. She carried a tray with food, something hot, something that smelled of broth and pepper, with bread and a small pot of what appeared to be actual butter. Mr. Vey said you hadn't eaten, the woman said. She set the tray on the table near the fire and did not look at Maribel's dress or her hair or the dried remnants of the rain. I'm Mrs. Delka. If you need anything, the house phone is on the nightstand. The 2 means the kitchen. Thank you, Maribel said. Mrs. Delka nodded once with the brevity of someone who had already moved on to the next task. She paused at the door. He said to tell you that the lawyer, Anita Voss, will be available tomorrow morning. She's independent. You can look her up if you want to verify. She left. Maribel looked at the food. She was hungry. Actually, practically hungry, in the physical animal sense, because she hadn't eaten since a small breakfast she'd forced down that morning out of wedding day obligation, and hunger in normal circumstances she'd learned to manage and suppress through years of practicing the particular self-denial that came with caring about what other people thought of her appetite. She ate everything on the tray. She ate without apologizing for it, without calculating it, without the background noise she'd spent years cultivating, the caloric arithmetic, the preemptive shame. She ate because she was hungry, and because the food was good, and because the woman who had needed to eat carefully to deserve Preston Vale's approval had left her ring on a marble floor and was not coming back. After, she sat for a long time in front of the fire. She thought about this contract Cassian had outlined on the drive over. Separate quarters that had already been demonstrated. Public appearances as his wife. Dinners, charity events. The specific social theater of his world. Access to a household account, to legal protections under the Vey name, to a security detail she was not to think of as a restriction, but as infrastructure. She'd asked him what happened to her when the arrangement ended, and he'd said, with the same flat precision he applied to everything, that she would have the resources to go wherever she needed to go and do whatever she chose to do. He'd said it without sentiment. She had believed it, which was a strange thing to believe about a man she'd known for 40 minutes. She thought about Preston. She did not cry. She had determined not to cry. Not because crying was wrong, but because the grief she felt right now was too compound and too specific to be handled with tears. It would require something else, something colder, and she was not ready for it tonight. She thought about what Cassian had said. He's been selling information. That was a fact, apparently. A fact Cassian Vey had access to, which meant it was probably not a small fact. It meant that the man she had been building a life with for 5 years had been doing something that operated well outside the boundaries of whatever she had understood his life to be. She did not know yet what to do with that, but she filed it. The way she had always filed things, quietly, precisely, in the part of her mind that she had trained since adolescence to hold things without being crushed by them. Tomorrow, there would be a lawyer. Tomorrow, she would read a contract with her own eyes and tell it where it was inadequate. Tomorrow, she would start to understand what she had actually walked into. Tonight, she put on the warmest clothes she could find in the closet, which turned out to be a dark gray, oversized pullover and thick wool socks. And she sat in the armchair by the fire, and she thought about what Cassian had said when she'd gotten into the car. I watched you make a decision. That was the thing. That was the thing nobody had said to her in years in a way that wasn't conditional. Not, I watched you make a mistake, or I watched you overreact, or I watched you embarrass both of us. Just a decision. A neutral, specific word that put the agency exactly where it belonged. She pulled her knees to her chest in the armchair and looked at the fire. Her name was Maribel Quince, and 6 hours ago she had been standing at the altar of the Grand Aurelia Hotel, believing that the problem was her body. Now she was in the house of the most dangerous man in the city, eating butter without guilt, beginning to think that the problem had never been her body at all. The fire burned down. She did not sleep until almost 4 in the morning, and when she did, she slept without dreaming, which was the first clean sleep she had gotten in longer than she could precisely name. She met Anita Voss at 9 the next morning in a room off the library that served as a small office, with bookshelves built into 2 walls and a window that looked out onto the rain-wet grounds. Anita Voss was 60, compact, and wearing a charcoal blazer with the specific kind of confidence that said she had long since passed the point where she dressed for anyone but herself. She had a briefcase and a legal pad, and she shook Maribel's hand with the grip of someone who had learned early that first impressions were infrastructure. Cassian was not present. He won't be in this room unless you invite him, Anita said before Maribel could ask. He understands that counsel is counsel. Whatever you tell me is not his to know unless you choose to tell him. Maribel sat across from her. Have you worked for him before? No. I know of him, obviously. Anita's expression was professionally neutral. He reached out to me this morning by referral through a colleague of mine. He told me you needed independent review of a contract, that you had no existing legal representation, and that he would pay my fee. I confirmed that the payment arrangement includes no expectations regarding my findings or advice. And you believe that? I verified it in writing. Anita opened her briefcase. So, should we look at what he's offering? The contract was 12 pages. They went through it for 2 hours. Anita was thorough in the way of someone who trusted no one's good intentions when documentation was available. She flagged 2 clauses that needed clarification, pushed back on the language around what constituted a breach of the arrangement from Maribel's side, and rewrote the termination section on her legal pad in language that was, she explained, considerably less ambiguous. Here's what I'll tell you honestly, Anita said, when they were finished going through the document. The terms are not what I'd call generous, but they're also not predatory. The security provisions are genuine. The household account is real money. The exit clause, once we fix this language, gives you a clear out with defined assets. Maribel was looking at the last page. And the personal provisions. Anita nodded. Separate quarters, which he's already demonstrated. No cohabitation expectation, no physical requirements of any kind explicitly stated. The public appearance calendar is capped at, she checked her pad, 8 events per month with reasonable notice required. What does he get out of it? He gets someone in that room with him who has a certain kind of social credibility. Anita paused. He did not elaborate on why that's valuable to him right now, but the timing of the offer, she gave Maribel a careful look. You understand you're not the first option he ever had. I know that, which means he needed someone quickly, and you were available in a specific way, and those two things may or may not be the same as wanting you specifically. She said it plainly, without softness, because Maribel had already demonstrated in the first 15 minutes of their meeting that softness was not what she was looking for. I'm not saying that's a reason to decline. I'm saying go in knowing what the transaction is. Maribel looked out the window. The grounds were beginning to show their shape through the receding rain, a long stretch of dark lawn, old trees still holding their last leaves, the far edge dropping away toward where the sound was. It was unexpectedly beautiful, and she resented that a little, the way beauty shows up uninvited in the worst weeks of your life. "What would you do?" she said. Not as a request for an answer, more as a genuine question, the kind you ask when you're trying to hear what you already know. Anita considered this. "I'd take it. I'd take it with the corrected terms, and I'd keep my eyes open, and I'd remember that I am in this arrangement for specific reasons that are mine, not his." She clicked her pen. "But I'm 60 years old, and I've seen what the alternative looks like when a woman leaves a situation like what you described last night with no resources and no plan." "He told you what happened last night. He told me you'd had a bad day and needed a contract reviewed." Anita's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. "I looked up the Grand Aurelia event calendar and made my own inferences." Maribel exhaled, looked back at the contract, fixed the termination language. "Add a clause that I have access to independent counsel at any point for any reason, at his cost. And I want it explicit that my signature on this document doesn't preclude me from pursuing any independent professional activity." Anita wrote it all down. "Good," she said. "Anything else?" "Yes." Maribel straightened the papers. "If he tries to modify any of these terms unilaterally after signing, I walk, and the exit clause activates in my favor regardless of time frame." Anita wrote that too, with the satisfaction of someone who had just been given the answer to a question she'd been hoping would be asked. "I'll have a revised draft by this afternoon." She found Cassian in the library, at a desk that looked like it had been in the room since the house was built, surrounded by documents that he moved in a specific, deliberate way when she came in, not hiding them exactly, organizing them into a different category of visible. He looked up. She sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited. "Anita is revising several terms," she said. "I'll sign the revised version." He did not say good or as expected or any of the things that would have been condescending. He simply nodded once. "She'll send it to my attorney for execution. I also want to understand something before I sign." He set down his pen. "Waiting. Preston, what he's been selling and to whom and what you're planning to do with it." She held his gaze. "You didn't pull over on a rainy street out of generosity. You need something that involves him, and you need a connection to his world. Tell me what it actually is." He was quiet for 3 seconds. The library was large enough that the quiet had room to settle without being uncomfortable. "Ronan Slate," he said then. She knew the name the same way she knew Cassian's, from the periphery, from the texture of this city's news when it talked about men who operated in the space between the laws it had. Slate ran the south side of a business that competed with whatever Cassian ran, and the competition had been, from what she understood, cold and structural and occasionally violent. "Slate has been using Preston to get inside information about my charitable operations," Cassian said. "Specifically, about the financial structure of a land acquisition I'm making through a foundation." He paused. "If Slate moves first, I lose the acquisition and several associated investments. If I move first, I need documentation of the breach, something that comes from the inside and can't be attributed to me. You want me to get that documentation?" He looked at her. "I thought you might have access to it. To his life, his network, the people who'd tell you things they wouldn't tell an investigator." "I haven't spoken to Preston since last night." "You will," Cassian said. "People like him always reach back. They need to manage the story." He picked up his pen again. "When he does, I need you to remember what I've told you." Maribel was quiet. She thought about 5 years. She thought about the microphone and the marble floor and the word too much in the amplified voice of a man who had spent half a decade eating at her table. She thought about what Anita had said. Go in knowing what the transaction is. "He'll call today," she said. "He always managed things quickly when he was scared of the optics." "Then we'll be ready," Cassian said. She stood. He was already looking back at his documents. "Vey," she said. He looked up. "I'm not doing this because of last night." She let the words sit flat, without apology or performance. "I'm doing this because you're offering something useful, and I intend to make it work for me. Don't mistake me for someone running away from something." He looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was not warm. It was something more precise than warmth. It was the expression of a man recalibrating an estimate, updating a variable. "I know what you are," he said. "That's why I stopped the car." She walked out. Behind her, the library was quiet. The rain had stopped. Through the window, the grounds were beginning to dry in the pale autumn light, and somewhere on the property, a bird was doing what birds do after a storm, announcing with unreasonable confidence that the world was still there and they were still in it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at the screen. Preston Vale. Calling. She stood in the corridor outside the library, phone in hand, and she did not answer it. Not yet. She let it ring through to voicemail, because she was not going to enter this conversation at his timing, on his terms, pulled in by his need to manage the story before it could be told without him. She would call back, but first she needed to know exactly what she was going to say. She turned back toward the library. "Vey," she said through the open door. He looked up again. "Tell me everything you know about what Slate needs from him." Her thumb hovered over Preston's name on the screen. "All of it. I want to know what I'm walking into before I take this call." Cassian Vey put down his pen a second time. And for the first time since she had climbed into that car in the rain, the expression on his face was something she could read clearly. Not warmth, not relief, but something specific to this moment. The recognition of a person who was going to be more useful than he'd planned for. He stood. "Close the door," he said. She did. The door clicked shut and the library became a different kind of room. Not smaller, it was still the same 16-foot ceilings and the same floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books that may or may not have ever been read, the same desk that looked older than the century. But the quality of the air changed, the way air changes in any space when the people inside it have stopped performing casualness and started doing something else. Cassian moved to the window. Not to look out, the grounds were still and offered nothing. It was the movement of a man who thought better in motion, but had learned to keep the motion contained. He put one hand flat on the windowsill and looked at the middle distance and began talking in the flat, precise way of someone reciting intelligence rather than telling a story. "Slate's been building toward this acquisition for 8 months," he said. "The parcel on Heron Point, waterfront, 42 acres, zoned for mixed development. I've been moving on it through the Vey Foundation for the last 4 months. Publicly, it's a conservation purchase. Waterfront preservation, walking trails, the kind of thing that gets a man photographed with a shovel and a hard hat." He paused. "Privately, it has a development covenant attached that activates in 7 years. By then, the zoning will be different, and the value will be 3 times what I'm paying." "Bull spectacle. And Slate wants it. Slate wants to stop me from having it." He turned from the window. "There's a difference. This isn't about the land. It's about the signal. If he can intercept this deal, it tells every investor, every family, every person in this city who watches that kind of thing that I can be outmaneuvered." He looked at her directly. "In my world, that signal travels faster than any news story, and it lasts longer." Maribel was standing near the door with her phone still in her hand. Preston's unanswered call sitting in her voicemail like a small piece of live ammunition. So he found Preston. Slate has people in certain social circles, fundraising circuits, charity boards, the kind of events where men like Preston Vale move because they like to be adjacent to money they didn't earn. A muscle moved in Cassian's jaw. Not anger exactly. Impatience, maybe. The specific impatience of a man who had spent years watching a category of person and had not softened his opinion. Preston was easy. He has debt he hasn't told anyone about. 3 failed investment vehicles in the last 18 months. His consulting income covers the surface but not what's underneath. "He never told me that." "No," Cassian said. "He wouldn't." He picked up a folder from his desk and crossed the room, held it out to her. "Financial summary. My analyst prepared it from public and semi-public sources. Nothing that required illegality to obtain." She took it, opened it. The numbers were organized in the clean, readable layout of someone who communicated through data for a living, and she went through them with the methodical focus she used when she needed to not react to something until she understood it fully. Preston was $340,000 underwater. She turned a page, then another. The picture assembled itself the way bad pictures do, not all at once, but incrementally, each new piece confirming a shape you'd already started to see and were hoping was wrong. The investment failures, the loan from his father that had been repaid in a suspicious lump sum 9 months ago, the timeline of deposits into a personal account that did not correspond to any documented income source. 9 months ago was when she had first noticed him being strange about money. She had asked him about it once, whether they should be thinking about combining finances before the wedding, whether it made sense for her to see the full picture. He had told her she was catastrophizing. She had been satisfied with that answer. She had wanted to be satisfied with that answer. She closed the folder. He's been paid by Slate since at least April, she said. March, Cassian said. The April deposits are the ones that are visible. The March arrangement was in cash. She exhaled. It came out steadier than she felt, which was a skill she'd developed and was grateful for now. What does he actually have access to? What could he tell Slate? The Foundation's board meeting minutes, the acquisition timeline, the name of my financial attorney. Cassian moved back to his desk, sat, and looked at her with the specific attention of a man waiting to see whether the person across from him was going to handle something or fracture under it. And the name of the conservation consultant I've been working with. If Slate can get to her, he can file an objection with the land trust that delays the acquisition by 6 to 8 months. That's enough time for his own offer to come in. Has he gotten to her? Not yet. He checked his watch. I believe she's still clean, but once Preston understands that last night has changed his access to information, and he will understand that quickly, he's going to need to give Slate something actionable before his value expires. Which is why he's calling. Yes. Maribel looked at her phone. Preston Vale. The name was familiar in the particular way of things you'd organized your life around, the same way her own address had been familiar, or the route to the office where she worked, or the side of the bed she slept on. Familiar, and therefore assumed, and now suddenly neither. If I answer this call, she said, and he doesn't know yet that I know what I know. What do you need me to find out? Whether Slate has already been in contact since last night, whether the Heron Point timeline is specifically what he's been reporting, or whether it's broader, and whether Preston has had any contact with Helena Marsh. The conservation consultant. Yes. Maribel put the folder on the corner of his desk. She looked at the phone one more time. Then she pressed call back and put it on speaker and set it on the desk between them. It rang twice. Mari. Preston's voice came through with the quality of a man who had been rehearsing this opening word for several hours. Not Maribel, the diminutive, which he only used when he was trying to land softly, trying to come through a door sideways instead of straight on. I've been trying to reach you. I know, she said. Her voice was even. Remarkably even, given what was currently happening in her chest, a kind of pressurized stillness, the physical sensation of holding something very tight, because releasing it would be premature. I was busy. A pause. Are you... Where are you? Your mother's been trying to reach you too. I'll call her later. She kept her eyes on the phone's screen rather than on Cassian. It was easier that way. What do you need, Preston? The use of his full name landed. She heard the small recalibration in his next breath. I need to know you're okay. Last night was... I handled that badly, Mari. I know I did. I've been up all night. You handled it with a microphone in front of 200 people, she said, still even. So I think we can skip the part where you tell me how badly you feel about the delivery method. I'm not calling about that. Not just about that. Another recalibration. She could hear the shape of his thinking that he was navigating towards something. She'd watched him do this before, in arguments, in conversations he found difficult. He orbited the actual point while building what he needed to get there. I'm calling because I'm worried about you. You left last night and nobody heard from you, and you're not at your apartment. How do you know I'm not at my apartment? Silence. She waited. I drove past, he said finally. You drove past my apartment at... She checked the time. 9:15 in the morning. I was worried. You drove past to see where my car was. She kept her voice exactly calibrated. Not angry. Anger would close him down, and she needed him open. Preston, I'm not going to play this game. Just tell me what you're actually calling about. He exhaled. The sound of a man deciding to try a different approach. I heard something this morning about a situation that might involve someone you're a beat. Someone you might be in contact with. What situation? A business thing. I can't explain it all on the phone, but there's a land deal that's being handled through a charitable structure, and I have reason to believe the people involved are not who they're claiming to be. And if you're another beat, if you ended up somewhere last night that has anything to do with what? She said. With Cassian Vey, he said. The name came out of the phone and spread through the library's air, and Cassian, on the other side of the desk, did not move at all. He was very still in the specific way of someone who had trained stillness into himself as a professional asset. No tell, no reaction, just a pair of eyes that were doing a great deal of thinking behind whatever expression he chose to show. Maribel kept her face neutral. Where did you hear that name? She said. It doesn't matter where I heard it. It matters to me. Preston's breathing changed. She had spent 5 years learning the variations of that breathing. The frustration breath. The I am trying to be patient breath. The breath that preceded him saying something he wanted to sound reasonable. This was a new one. Tighter. Someone told me that a woman matching your description left the Aurelia last night in a vehicle registered to the Vey Property Management Company. And I am trying to tell you that that person is not someone you should be around, Mari. He is genuinely dangerous. I'm telling you this because I care about you regardless of what happened last night. A woman matching my description, she said. You mean a fat woman in a wet wedding dress? It's a reasonably specific description, Preston. I'm just confirming. Maribel? His voice shifted again. The sharpness underneath the management, the edge that came through when the management stopped working. I need you to tell me where you are. I need to know you're safe, and there is something happening with that man's business right now that you do not want to be near. I have information. I have specific information that makes your involvement in anything he's doing very dangerous for you. She picked up the phone, took it off speaker, held it to her ear and turned a half step away from the desk. Not because she needed privacy from Cassian, he could hear the room's half of the conversation clearly enough, but because she needed to do something with her body while she completed this. What information? She said. Not on the phone. Then we're done with this call. Maribel? You want to meet? She said. You want to see me and you want to tell me things that will make me feel like I need to leave wherever I am and come back into your orbit. That is what this call is. She could hear her own voice doing something she hadn't planned. It was going colder, slower, a temperature drop of several degrees across each word. I'm going to save us both some time. I know about the debt. I know about the deposits since March. And I know about Ronan's slate. The silence that followed was the loudest sound she'd heard since the ring hitting the marble floor. What did you just say? He said. His voice was very quiet now. The management was completely gone. I said I know about Slate. She kept her voice level, looking at a middle shelf of books she was not reading. So if you want to have a real conversation, call me back when you've decided what that looks like. Don't call back to manage me. Call back when you're ready to be honest. She ended the call. She put the phone on the desk. She stood with her hands braced on the edge of the desk and breathed through what the last 3 minutes had cost her. Not the performance of calm that had come from somewhere trained and deep, and she trusted it, but the specific energy expense of holding herself together while dismantling something she'd built carefully over 5 years. Helena Marsh, she said without looking up. He didn't mention her. No, Cassian said. Which means either he hasn't been directed toward her yet, or he's smart enough not to confirm anything until he knows how much you know. She straightened. He's not smart enough. He's scared. He'll call back within the hour. Cassian was watching her with that recalibrating expression again. She was getting better at reading it. It wasn't admiration exactly, or warmth. It was something more like the specific attention of a man who had spent years making accurate assessments of people and was currently updating one. You're angry? He said. Yes. You don't sound it. I know. She picked up the folder from the corner of the desk and held it. When I'm very angry, I get quiet. It's a thing about me. It gets worse before it gets better. She looked at him. Don't mistake it for okay. He nodded once, and she believed that nod, which was strange. It was the nod of a man who had received information rather than given reassurance, and it landed differently than reassurance would have. Preston called back in 40 minutes. He was ready to be honest in the specific way of a man who had decided that honesty was now the most strategic available option, which was not the same as actual honesty, but was close enough to be useful. He told her about Slate. He did not tell her everything. She could feel the architecture of what he was withholding, the deliberate gaps that he filled with elaboration on the things he did say, but he confirmed the Heron Point timeline, confirmed that Slate's objective was delay rather than direct acquisition, and confirmed that he had been given a name, a woman connected to the Conservation Trust, and had been asked to make contact. He had not made contact yet. He wanted to make a deal. Not in those words. He would not have used those words about himself in this moment. The vanity of a man who still needed to be the one who operated rather than the one who got operated on. But that was the shape of it. He was trying to trade what he had for a position that left him standing. She told him she'd think about it. She said it with enough warmth, not much, but enough, that he believed she might. After she ended the call, she told Cassian everything. He listened without interrupting, which was a specific kind of discipline she was beginning to understand as characteristic rather than unusual. He did not fill silence with his own reactions. He let the information arrive, and then he sat with it for a moment, and then he said, Helena Marsh needs to know today. Can you reach her? Yes. He was already picking up a different phone, not his personal one, a second one that lived in his desk drawer. He looked at Maribel before he dialed. You handled that well. She looked at him. I know, she said. That's not the hard part. What's the hard part? Figuring out what to do about the fact that he didn't just sell your information. She held the folder, felt its weight, which was more than paper. He sold it specifically to set something in motion that would, if it worked, if Slate got the delay and your deal collapsed, the fallout would have circled back to the Foundation's donors. You have individual donors on that conservation board. He was still. I pulled up the Foundation's public filing last night, she said. There are 11 individual major donors listed. 3 of them are women who have used your Foundation's domestic legal assistance program. She set the folder down. If the acquisition collapses and the Foundation's finances get scrutinized as part of any legal challenge Slate files, those women's involvement in the assistance program becomes part of the public record in the proceedings. The room was very quiet. Slate knows that, she said. That's the actual weapon, not the land. The land is the surface. Underneath it, he's got a mechanism that exposes 3 women who trusted a private program to stay private. She looked at Cassian, and for the first time she saw something move through his face that was not professional or calibrated, something that came from somewhere older and more personal, a specific kind of pain that arrived quickly and then was controlled with visible effort. You knew about the domestic assistance program risk. Yes, he said. It came out different from his other words, lower. Preston didn't figure that out on his own. She kept her voice level. Someone told him where to look, or Slate's people did, which means someone on the inside of the Foundation gave Slate enough to know that those women existed in that program. Cassian set the second phone down on the desk without dialing. His face had gone very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Not controlled, but locked. The expression of someone absorbing something they had not allowed themselves to fully believe until this moment. There's someone on your board, she said. He didn't confirm it immediately. He didn't need to. The confirmation was in the locked stillness and the way his jaw was working and the fact that he had stopped dialing Helena Marsh's number. How long have you suspected? She said. 6 weeks, he said. Who? He looked at her. That is not something I'm going to... If you don't tell me who you suspect, I can't help you rule it out. Or in. She picked up the folder again, held it. You brought me into this. You can't bring me halfway in and then decide where the walls are. Another long silence, the kind that had a decision in it. Warren Lyle, he said finally. Foundation vice chair. 15-year relationship. He said it with the flat delivery of someone removing a piece of shrapnel. Efficient, because speed was the only mercy available. He introduced me to 2 of the donors who are now in the assistance program. The weight of that sat in the room. If he's the one, she said, and Slate already has what he needs from him, then the call to Helena is a warning that comes too late. His voice had gone somewhere she hadn't heard it go yet. Not cold, not measured, but stripped of the professional layer entirely for one word and then rebuilt. I know. She watched him. He was looking at the desk, at nothing in particular on the desk. She had been reading him for less than 24 hours, and she already knew this look. Not the calculating distance, not the deliberate stillness, but the look of a man who was carrying something that he had learned not to put down, because putting it down, even once, had cost him more than carrying it ever had. His dead sister was in this room right now, she understood. Not literally, not in any way she could name or prove, but she understood it the way you understand certain things about people, not from what they say, but from what they protect. The domestic assistance program, the women who had used it, the specific personal nature of that protection. She did not say anything about it. Call Helena, she said instead. Now, not in an hour. Whatever Slate knows, she needs to know that someone might be coming. He picked up the phone. She turned toward the door to give him the room, and because she needed 30 seconds outside of it, 30 seconds in the corridor with the old carpet and the quiet, where she could breathe without the weight of the last hour pressing down on every exhale. She was standing in the corridor, one hand on the wall, head down, doing exactly that, just breathing. When Drum appeared at the far end of the corridor, walking fast. Drum never walked fast. She turned. His face was carrying something. She read it before he spoke, not alarm exactly, because she suspected Drum had trained alarm out of his face years ago, but the compact, deliberate tightness of a man delivering information that changes the situation. There's something you need to see, he said. She looked back at the library door. He's on a call. This is for you, Drum said. Not him. He looked at her steadily. You specifically. She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear. The cold, specific sensation of a variable she hadn't accounted for arriving without warning. What is it? Drum held out a phone. Not hers, not Cassian's. A phone she'd never seen. On the screen was a photograph. She took the phone. The photograph was taken in low light, slightly grainy, the kind of quality that comes from a camera doing its best in a difficult situation. It showed a room she recognized. The small private dining room at Collier's on the waterfront, a restaurant she and Preston had gone to regularly. Dark booths and low lighting, and the kind of careful discretion that expensive places offered their guests. Preston was in the photograph. He was sitting across a table from a man she didn't recognize. Thick-set, late 50s, a face that was not memorable in any specific feature, but was memorable in its entirety for the specific quality of its watchfulness. The man's hands were on the table, and between them, partially visible, was a document. She zoomed in. The document had a header she could make out in 3 words before the resolution failed. Vey Foundation Beneficiary. The photograph had a timestamp in the bottom right corner. Last night. 11:47 p.m. While she had been sitting in an armchair in this house, eating everything on a dinner tray and beginning to believe she had made the right decision, her thumb moved to the next photograph. In the second photograph, Preston was handing the document across the table. In the third photograph, the man she didn't recognize was looking at the document, and Preston was looking directly at the camera. Not because he knew it was there, she could tell that, but because he'd happened to look up at the wrong moment. And his face in that photograph was doing something she recognized from years of watching him, from the specific catalog she had built of his expressions across 5 years of shared proximity. He was relieved, the same relief that had been in his face at the altar, the same relief of a man setting down something heavy without caring about what the thing lands on. She lowered the phone. Down the corridor, through the library door, she could hear Cassian's voice, low, controlled, the voice of someone delivering an urgent message with deliberate calm. Helena Marsh's call. Still in time, maybe. Maybe not. She looked at the photograph one more time. Then she looked at Drum. Who took these, she said. We had eyes on Vale since last night, Drum said. Standard surveillance when a situation is active. The analyst flagged these 40 minutes ago. He paused. The man across the table from him is not Slate. Then who is he? Drum's expression didn't change. His name is Gareth Cowell. He's Warren Lyle's attorney. The corridor was very quiet. Warren Lyle, Foundation Vice Chair, 15-year relationship. The man Cassian had named 12 minutes ago with the particular delivery of someone removing shrapnel. She understood the shape of it now. Not all the details, not the full architecture, but the shape. Preston hadn't been working for Slate directly. He'd been working for Lyle, who was working with Slate, which meant the breach wasn't a rival organization finding a useful weak point from the outside. It was an inside mechanism, a constructed vulnerability, someone who had been in the room for 15 years and had chosen his moment. And the photographs, taken 40 minutes ago, sent to Drum's phone, routed to her specifically, meant that someone wanted her to have this information before Cassian did. She looked at Drum. Why me? Why not take this directly to him? Drum met her eyes. Because the analyst who flagged it works for me, he said. Not Vey directly, and because... He stopped. Chose something. Because the analyst's first loyalty is to the Foundation's program, the women in it. He looked at her steadily. And because you were the one in that room 30 minutes ago who understood what the actual weapon was. Before he did. The library door opened. Cassian came into the corridor. He read the room immediately. Her face, Drum's posture, the phone in her hand, and his eyes went directly to the phone. Helena Marsh has already been contacted, he said, by someone she didn't know, 2 hours ago. His voice was completely flat. She's out. Maribel held out the phone. He took it, looked at the photographs. She watched him go through them with the same catalog reading efficiency she'd used, and she watched his face do the thing it had done in the library when she'd named the Domestic Assistance Program. The fast arrival of something old and personal, and the fast control of it. He got to the third photograph, the one of Preston looking up. He lowered the phone. Lyle, he said. Yes, she said. He was very still. The corridor felt smaller than it was. How long have you... Drum brought it to me 4 minutes ago. She kept her voice even. I'm telling you now. He looked at her. There was something in the look that she recognized from 24 hours of reading this man's face. Not the recalibrating expression, not the professional assessment. This was something that did not have a professional category. It was the look of a man who had been operating in a world where information was leverage and trust was a liability, and who had just been handed something that did not compute within that framework. Someone had brought information to her first, and she had brought it to him immediately. I need to know, he said, what you know about Lyle's attorney. Nothing yet, she said. But I can find out. How? She thought about it for 3 seconds. Gareth Cowell. If he's Lyle's attorney of record, he has professional exposure in this. He handed a Foundation beneficiary document to a person who then transmitted it to someone with a competing financial interest in the Foundation's primary asset. She held Cassian's gaze. That's not just a betrayal, that's a crime. And the crime has a witness list. Cassian looked at her. Preston, she said, is the witness list. The corridor was very quiet again. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a car was coming up the private road. She could hear the tires on the wet gravel, slow and deliberate. She didn't know whose car it was yet. From the change in Drum's posture, she guessed it was expected, but Cassian wasn't looking toward the sound. He was still looking at her. You understand, he said slowly, that if we use Preston as the documentation for Lyle's breach, if we make him the witness, then we need him cooperative. And to get him cooperative, he needs to believe he has something to gain. Yes, she said, and the only person he'll believe that from right now is me, she said. I know. She looked down the corridor toward the window at the far end, where the wet driveway was visible and the approaching car was coming into view. A vehicle she didn't recognize. 2 men in the front seat. I need you to understand something, Cassian said. He said it quietly, in the stripped voice he'd used when he said, I know about Helena Marsh, the one without the professional layer. If you do this, if you go back to Preston and bring him in, you are not a bystander in this anymore. Whatever happens after, you are in it. She turned back to him. She thought about the ring on the marble floor, about the folder with $340,000 of debt, about the women in the assistance program whose names were in a document that had crossed a restaurant table at 11:47 last night, about the word too much amplified through a microphone in a ballroom. I was never going to be a bystander, she said. That was never the option you were actually offering me." He looked at her for a long moment. The car stopped in the driveway. The front door of the house opened, and Mrs. Delka's voice came from the entry hall, greeting someone with the specific tone of a woman who had been notified of an arrival she did not entirely welcome. "Who's here?" Maribel said. Cassian's expression changed. And in that change, in the very specific, very controlled tightening of his face around something he had not planned for, she understood that whoever was walking through the front door of this house right now was someone neither of them was ready for. "Stay in the corridor," he said, moving past her. She did not stay in the corridor. She followed him to the top of the stairs and looked down into the entry hall, where Mrs. Delka was standing with her hands folded and her face set in the professional blankness of someone who had been given instructions she disagreed with, and where a man in an expensive gray coat was standing on the marble floor looking up. Late 60s. White-haired. The kind of face that belonged on the wall of a boardroom or the masthead of a charitable foundation. He was looking at Cassian. Then he looked at her. Warren Lyle smiled. It was the smile of a man who had walked into a room he'd already been in 1,000 times. A room he believed he owned, and who had not yet processed that something in the room had fundamentally and irreversibly changed while he wasn't looking. "Cassian," he said, "I heard you had a house guest." His eyes moved back to Maribel with a specific quality of assessment. Not hostile, worse than hostile. Dismissive. The glance of a man cataloging something he did not consider a threat. "I thought we should talk." Cassian was one step below Maribel on the staircase. She could feel him deciding something. She put her hand on the banister and came down one step so that she was standing level with him, and they were both visible from the entry hall, both at the top of the staircase, looking down at Warren Lyle and his expensive coat and his smile that did not know yet what was standing above it. "Warren," Cassian said. His voice had gone to a place she had not heard it go before. Not the flat precision, not the stripped honesty. Something older than either. The voice of a man who had trusted someone for 15 years and was now looking at the specific shape of what that trust had cost him. "We'll talk," he said. Warren Lyle was still smiling. He had not looked at the folder on the library desk. He had not seen the photographs on Drum's phone. He did not know what the last 24 hours had built in this house, what two people who had been strangers until last night had put together in the quiet of a library and a corridor and 30 seconds of breathing against a wall. He was still smiling. And standing on the staircase above him, Maribel Quince, who had come here in a ruined dress with nothing but cold clarity and a spine that Preston Vale had spent 5 years trying to bend, understood that Warren Lyle was about to make the last mistake that a man makes when he walks into a room still believing he controls it. He had not looked at her. He should have looked at her. Warren Lyle had the kind of stillness that came from decades of sitting at tables where other men were louder. He stood in the entry hall with his coat still on and his hands loose at his sides, and he looked up at the two of them on the staircase with the patient expression of a man who had learned that waiting cost nothing and revealed everything. He did not fill the silence. He let it sit there, which was itself a move. The move of someone who understood that whoever spoke first in a room like this was already behind. Cassian came down the stairs. Maribel stayed where she was, one hand on the banister, 2 steps from the bottom, because she understood instinctively that her position, elevated, visible, present, was information. She was not background. She was not a house guest to be managed around. She was going to stand exactly where she was and let Warren Lyle decide what to do with that. He decided to ignore her. "You should have called," Cassian said. He reached the entry hall floor and stopped at a distance that was not casual. 6 feet. The distance of a conversation that both parties understood was not social. "I don't do unannounced." "I know." Lyle looked around the entry hall with the proprietary ease of a man taking inventory of something he considered his. "I've been calling since this morning. You weren't picking up." "I was busy." "I know that too." Lyle's eyes moved briefly back up to Maribel. Eventful night for everyone, apparently. He said it the way men like him said things about women they'd decided weren't worth full sentences. Abbreviated, slightly amused, designed to communicate that she was a footnote in a conversation between the people who actually mattered. Maribel watched him do it and filed it. "Library," Cassian said. Not a suggestion. Lyle moved toward the library with the ease of a man who'd walked that route before, and Cassian fell in beside him, and Maribel came down the last two stairs and followed them both. Because nobody had told her not to, and she had decided sometime in the last 12 hours that she was done operating on the assumption that she needed permission to be in a room. Lyle noticed her following. He glanced back once. He did not say anything, which was its own kind of statement. The statement of a man who had decided she was Cassian's problem to manage, not his. In the library, Cassian did not sit. He stood near the desk with his arms at his sides, and Lyle took the chair across from it. Maribel's chair from that morning, she noticed. The chair where she had sat with Anita Voss going through 12 pages of contract language, and settled into it with the ease of a man settling into something familiar. Maribel stood near the bookshelf, not behind Cassian, to the side where she had a clear line of sight to both of them. "I heard about Helen Marsh," Lyle said. He said it first, which was its own move, preempting, establishing that he already knew, already had a position relative to the information. "Unfortunate. Someone got to her before we could warn her," Cassian said. "These things happen when a situation moves quickly." Lyle pressed his fingers together in his lap. "I've been saying for months that the Heron Point timeline was too compressed, that we were moving without enough—" "Who contacted her?" Cassian said. Lyle paused. A small pause, well managed. "I don't know the specifics of how Slate operates. I'm not asking about Slate." Cassian's voice had the quality of something being sharpened rather than raised. "I'm asking who from inside the Foundation made contact with Marsh's office before I did this morning." The library was very quiet. Lyle looked at Cassian with an expression Maribel was reading carefully. Not guilt, because guilt required a person to believe they had done something wrong, and this man had clearly constructed a framework in which what he had done was reasonable, even necessary. What she was reading was something more specific, the expression of a man recalculating how much the person across from him knew, running a fast internal audit of what was exposed and what was still covered. "You've been talking to someone," Lyle said finally. His voice was still even, still the voice of a man in a boardroom. "Someone has given you a version of this situation that I'd like to—" "Gareth Cowell," Cassian said. The name hit Lyle the way a name hits a person when it arrives from a direction they didn't expect. A small physical thing, barely visible, a fractional tightening around the eyes, and a stillness that was different from his previous stillness. Controlled. "But there. He's my attorney," Lyle said. "Of course I've had conversations with him about—" "At Collier's," Cassian said. "Last night, 11:47, with Preston Vale." The fractional tightening became something that had weight to it. Lyle was still sitting in the chair with his fingers pressed together and his coat on, and the coat suddenly looked like what it was, something a man wore when he was not planning to stay, when he wanted to be able to leave quickly, when he had come to assess rather than to commit. "I know about the beneficiary document," Cassian said. Lyle looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something Maribel had not predicted. He looked at her. Directly. Fully for the first time. Not the dismissive glance from the entry hall, but an actual look. The look of a man who was updating his understanding of the room and had identified the variable he'd miscalculated. "She told you," Lyle said. "She showed me photographs," Cassian said, "that your attorney took to a restaurant and handed to a man who has been selling my information for 6 months. Lyle breathed in slowly through his nose. Out. The breath of a man who had spent decades doing this, receiving information that required recalibration, not in private but in front of other people, and learning to perform the recalibration as a kind of dignity rather than a collapse. "You don't understand what Heron Point is," he said. His voice had changed. Not the boardroom voice anymore, something older and more direct underneath it, the voice the boardroom voice had been constructed to replace. "You think it's a conservation acquisition with a 7-year covenant. That's what I thought 8 months ago. That's what you told the board. That's what it is." "No." Lyle leaned forward slightly. 8 months ago, I started looking at the Land Trust's historical filings. Because I do my job, Cassian. I do my actual job, not the version of it you assigned me. And what I found in those filings—" He stopped, recalibrated again. "There is a second covenant on that land. Not the one you disclosed to the board. A private covenant held through a shell structure in Delaware that predates your Foundation's involvement by 11 years. Silence. Maribel's hand tightened on the edge of the bookshelf. "That covenant," Lyle said. Gives the holder the right to develop the sound-adjacent parcels regardless of conservation protections. Which means when your 7-year window opens and the zoning changes, the development value does not accrue to the foundation. It accrues to whoever holds that Delaware structure. He looked at Cassian. I spent 6 weeks trying to find out who holds it. Cassian said nothing. I found out 4 weeks ago, Lyle said. He held Cassian's gaze. It's you, not the foundation. You, personally, through a holding company 3 layers removed from anything with your name on it. The library was so quiet Maribel could hear the fire in the grate, the small reports of settling wood. She looked at Cassian. His face was doing nothing she could read. That was itself information. The face of a man who had gone somewhere behind the professional layer and closed the door, not because he was surprised, but because he was deciding. She understood this now, the particular quality of his blankness when he was making a decision, as distinct from the blankness he used as a default. The donors in the assistance program, Lyle said. His voice was quieter now. Less boardroom, more something that sounded almost like grief. Those women gave money to a conservation trust because they believed in it, because you presented it to them as the thing you said it was. And underneath it, he stopped. I couldn't bring this to you. I tried to think of a way to bring this to you, and I couldn't find one that didn't end with you burying it, so I found another way. Slate, Cassian said. Slate has the resources to file a challenge that forces the Delaware structure into the public record, Lyle said. Without that, you used Preston Vale, Cassian's voice was very flat. You used a man who is already compromised, already being paid, to carry a document with the names of women who trusted this foundation. I used him to transmit a timeline to Gareth, Lyle said. The beneficiary document was not supposed to... He stopped. Something moved across his face. Preston was not supposed to have that document. Gareth was handling the custody. If Preston obtained it separately, he obtained it from your office, Maribel said. Both men looked at her. She had not spoken since the entry hall, and she felt the shift in the room when her voice arrived. The recalibration, the forced acknowledgement of the third person in the space who had been standing at the bookshelf putting things together while the two of them performed their version of this conversation. Preston has a contact in your assistant's office, she said to Lyle. A woman named Claire Voth. They dated briefly 3 years ago. She's been his access point for 6 months, which means everything you received from Cassian came to Preston before it came to Gareth Cowell. She kept her voice level. The beneficiary document was not a leak from Gareth's custody. It was copied from your files before it ever reached Gareth. Preston had it for 12 days before that dinner at Collier's. Lyle stared at her. How do you... Because Preston told me this morning, she said. He told me more than he planned to, because he was scared and because he needed me to believe he was giving me everything, and because men like him always over-explain when they're trying to seem helpful. She looked at Lyle steadily. He's been playing both sides for longer than you knew. He was your pipeline in and Slate's pipeline in simultaneously, and at some point in the last 6 months, he stopped being a tool either of you were fully controlling. The silence that followed was a different quality from the previous silences. This one had a shape. The shape of a situation that had just become significantly more complex for everyone in the room, in different ways and for different reasons, and none of those reasons were comfortable. Lyle sat back. For the first time since he'd walked through the front door, he looked something other than managed. He looked old. Not in the physical sense. He was still the same white-haired man in the expensive coat, but in the way a person looks old when the architecture they've been standing inside of starts to show its cracks all at once. The Delaware structure, Maribel said. She turned to Cassian. She made herself look at him directly. Is it what he said? Cassian was very still. Is there a second covenant? She said. In your name. He looked at her, and in that look, in the specific quality of it, the way he was holding her gaze with something that was not quite the professional blankness and not quite anything she had a category for, she got her answer before he gave it. It's more complicated than he's framed it, Cassian said. That's not a no, she said. No, he said. It's not, she breathed. Once. The breath of someone who has just received confirmation of something they were hoping was wrong and had been preparing in the back of their mind for the possibility that it wasn't. She thought about Anita Voss, about 12 pages of contract language and the specific care they had taken with the termination clause. About the independent counsel provision she had insisted on, about the way she had sat across from Cassian Vey in this room that morning and decided, not from desperation, she had been very clear about that, not from desperation, that this was a move worth making. She thought about the women in the assistance program. 3 names in a foundation filing, connected to a land acquisition that was not what it had been presented to be, connected to a shell structure 3 layers removed from a man who had opened a car door in the rain and offered her a transaction. She thought about the word he had used, transaction. She had thought, over the last 24 hours, that she was beginning to understand what the transaction actually was. She was revising that understanding now, in real time, in a library in front of a fire, with 2 men who had both, in different ways and for different reasons, built their version of this situation on assumptions about what she would and would not see. "Get out," she said to Lyle. He looked at her. "This conversation is done," she said. "Whatever you came here to do, whatever version of this you thought you were going to manage, it's done. Go back to your attorney and tell him that the photographs from Collier's are already in circulation and that cooperating is his only available option." She held his gaze. "I'll be calling him myself this afternoon." Lyle looked at Cassian. "She's right," Cassian said. His voice was quiet. Lyle stood. He buttoned his coat. He did it slowly, with the deliberateness of a man performing dignity because it was the only currency he had left in this room, and he walked to the library door and paused with his hand on the frame. "The women in that program," he said. To Cassian, not to her. "I want you to know that was not the intention." Cassian said nothing. Lyle left. The front door closed. The sound of his car on the gravel came through the window and then receded. And then the estate was quiet again, with the specific quiet of a space that has just had something significant leave it. Maribel stood at the bookshelf. She did not turn around immediately. She looked at the books on the shelf in front of her. Old spines, mostly. The kind of books that accumulate in a house over generations rather than being purchased deliberately. And she breathed, and she did what she had learned to do with things that needed to be handled before they could be felt. She handled it first. "The Delaware structure," she said. Walk me through it." "Maribel, walk me through it," she said again. She turned around. "I'm not doing this emotionally. I'm not going to have a reaction before I understand what I'm having a reaction to. So explain it." Cassian looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to the desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and removed a folder she hadn't seen before, thicker than the one she'd held this morning, worn at the edges. He set it on the desk. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair Lyle had just vacated. It was still warm. She ignored that. He sat across from her and opened the folder. The structure was not simple. She had expected it not to be simple because nothing about this man was simple. And the older she was getting by the hour, the more she understood that simplicity in this world was either performance or naivety, and he was neither. The Delaware Holding Company was real. The personal covenant was real. But the picture Lyle had drawn, of a man secretly redirecting Foundation assets to personal profit through a concealed legal mechanism, was, she could see as she went through the documentation, incomplete. The covenant had been structured to protect the development rights from a specific scenario, a hostile acquisition by a competitor who had tried, 11 years ago, to gain control of the Heron Point parcel and use it as leverage against the Vey Network's legitimate real estate operations. The shell structure had been the defensive mechanism. Over 11 years, it had been maintained because the threat it defended against had never fully disappeared. The Foundation's involvement had come later. The conservation acquisition was genuine, or had been, when it was designed. The 7-year covenant was real. The charitable mission was real. And the shell structure had never been dissolved. "You intended to dissolve it," she said. She looked up from the documents. "Before the acquisition closed." He met her eyes. "Yes." "But you hadn't yet." "No." "Because Lyle started moving before you expected him to." "Because I didn't know Lyle was moving at all," he said. The stripped voice again. No professional layer, no management, just the flat weight of something he wasn't going to decorate. "I found out 6 weeks ago that there was a breach. I did not know the breach was Lyle until this morning." She looked at him. She thought about what Drum had said in the corridor. "The analyst who flagged it works for me." Not Vey directly. She thought about the photographs being routed to her specifically before they went to Cassian. She thought about the analyst's first loyalty being to the Foundation's program. And she thought about the specific timing of things. Lyle walking through the front door exactly when the photographs had arrived, exactly when the library conversation had happened, exactly when she and Cassian had been in the same room, understanding the shape of this together. She thought about the car door in the rain. "Why me?" she said. He looked at her. "I keep coming back to it," she said. "You said you watched me at a fundraiser. You said you needed a wife quickly. You said the optics—" She stopped. "None of that is the real reason." She held his gaze. "Tell me the real reason." The fire in the grate was burning lower. Outside the window, the grounds had gone from pale autumn light to the flat gray of late morning, and the sound was visible in the distance, dark and cold, and the whole place had the quality of a painting that was beautiful in a way that was not designed to comfort anyone. "I needed someone Lyle wouldn't suspect," Cassian said. She was still. "He's been watching my operations for 8 months. He knows my network. He knows Drum. He knows my attorneys. He knows every person in my professional infrastructure." He looked at her with the expression that was not warmth, but was something. Something that existed in the space between professional regard and whatever lived past it. "He didn't know you. Nobody in my world knew you. You were outside the system entirely. I was a random woman at an altar," she said. "You were a specific woman at an altar," he said, "who I had seen 6 weeks before that, at the Whitmore Foundation dinner, standing alone while people who didn't deserve to be in the same room with you made themselves feel better at your expense. Who didn't leave. Who stayed and did what she came to do and didn't give them the satisfaction." He paused. "And who had a direct connection to Preston Vale." The room tilted slightly. Not physically, but something in her orientation to this conversation shifted, the way a familiar room looks different when you realize you've been standing at the wrong angle to see the whole of it. "You knew about Preston before the wedding," she said. "I knew he was a breach vector," Cassian said. "I knew he had access to people and information he shouldn't have. I did not know how deep it went." He looked at her directly. "I did not engineer last night. I want to be clear about that. What happened at the Aurelia was not—" "But you were there," she said. "You were outside." "I had a meeting at the hotel earlier in the evening. When I saw the scene developing," he stopped. "I made a decision." She was quiet. She was looking at him, and she was very quiet. And in the quiet, she was running back through the last 24 hours with this new information applied to it. The way you run a correction through a calculation and watch all the subsequent numbers change. The car in the rain. The contract offered immediately, fully formed, with a lawyer's name already ready. The clothes in the closet, the right sizes, no apology in the cut. Prepared. Not for her specifically, but prepared for the possibility of her. "The contract," she said. "The terms. The independent counsel." "Yes." "You expected me to negotiate." "I expected you to be exactly who you were," he said, which was someone who would not accept terms that left her exposed. She breathed. She was angry. She was aware of the anger moving through her. Not the cold, controlled variety she'd used on the phone with Preston, but something warmer and less managed. The anger of a person who has been accurate in their self-assessment and has just discovered that someone else was also accurate in their assessment of them, and that the second accuracy had been operational before she even knew she was a variable. She had walked into this believing it was a choice she had made. It was a choice she had made. That was the complexity of it. Both things were true simultaneously, and the simultaneous truth of them was harder to hold than either one alone. "The women in the assistance program," she said, "are they actually at risk?" "Yes," he said. "If Lyle files through Slate and the Delaware structure comes into discovery, yes. Their involvement in the program becomes part of the record." "Then that's what we fix first," she said. He looked at her. "Maribel, I'm not done being angry," she said. "I'm going to be angry about this for a considerable amount of time, and when I'm ready to do that fully, I will do it fully, and you will not enjoy it." She held his gaze. "But those women are real, and they are in danger, and you built the thing that endangered them, and I am inside it now, which means I am going to help you fix it, because it is the right thing to do. Not for you, for them." He was looking at her. "After that," she said, "you and I are going to have a very different conversation about what this arrangement actually is." "I know," he said. "Good." She stood. Call Drum. I need to know where Preston is right now. She moved toward the door. He's at the Meridian, Drum said from the corridor. She stopped, looked at the doorway. Drum was standing just outside it with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who had been there for longer than either of them had realized, and had made a specific professional decision about when to announce himself. The Meridian Hotel, Drum said. He checked in this morning, room 412. He paused. He's not alone. There's a second guest registered to the room under a name that came back as a shell identity. Maribel looked at Cassian. Cassian stood. Slate's people, he said. It was not a question. The vehicle in the lot is registered to a logistics company out of Newark with 3 documented connections to Slate's distribution network, Drum said. The room was very still. Preston Vale was in a hotel room with Ronan Slate's people, which meant that whatever Preston had told Maribel on the phone this morning about wanting to cooperate, about being scared, about having information he was willing to trade, that conversation had been happening simultaneously with a different conversation, in a different register, with different people. She had thought Preston was scared enough to flip. Preston was scared enough to accelerate. He's not going to give us the documentation, she said. The anger was still there, but it had changed temperature. Gone back to the cold variety, the useful kind. He called me this morning to find out what we had, not to give us what he had. And now he's with Slate's people, and he's giving them whatever I told him on that call. She had told him they knew about Slate. She had told him they knew about the deposits. She had told him, with the confidence of someone who believed they were operating from the stronger position, that she knew about Ronan Slate, and he had gone directly to Ronan Slate. The charity auction, she said. She looked at Cassian. The Heron Point Foundation benefit. When is it? 4 days, Cassian said. His voice was careful. Slate knows the timeline. He knows you know about the breach. He knows you've warned Helena Marsh. She was thinking fast, and she could feel the shape of it assembling, the kind of cold clarity that arrived when she stopped trying to manage her anger and just let it be fuel. He has 4 days to make a move before the acquisition closes, and Preston just told him that the move needs to happen before you can build a case around the documentation. The auction, Cassian said. He's not going to wait for another opportunity, she said. The auction is public. It's the Foundation's biggest event. If he can create a crisis there, publicly, visibly, it doesn't matter whether the Delaware structure ever comes out. The Foundation's credibility collapses in real time, and the acquisition dies with it. Cassian looked at Drum. Drum looked at Maribel. She understood in that moment that she had just stepped off the edge of something. Not the edge she'd stepped off when she got in the car 2 nights ago, which had been a step she'd taken with reasonable information and clear eyes. This was different. This was the edge that appeared when you were already moving, when you'd committed to the direction and the ground changed under your feet, and you were suddenly somewhere you had not planned to be, with a decision to make that was not the decision you'd prepared for. Preston Vale was in a hotel room with Slate's people, and he had her voice on a phone call with enough information to walk Slate directly into the next move. Because she had trusted her read of a scared man, because she had been good at reading people her whole life, and had been wrong about the person she'd spent 5 years building a life with, wrong in specific ways, that were now sitting in a hotel room across town, making themselves useful to the most dangerous man on the East Coast. She pressed her hands flat against the desk, felt the wood. Solid, old, present. I need to go to that auction, she said. Maribel, Cassian said. His voice carried something she hadn't heard in it before, but not the professional precision, not the stripped honesty. Something that was trying to be careful with her and wasn't sure how. You don't have to, I'm the only one Slate hasn't mapped, she said. Your network, your attorneys, your security, he's had 8 months to map all of it. He doesn't know me. He doesn't know what I know or how I know it or what I'm capable of. She looked up. I'm the variable he hasn't accounted for, which means I'm the only advantage you have left. She held Cassian's gaze, and in his eyes, in that specific quality that was not warmth but lived near it, that she had been trying to name since the rain-slicked street outside the Grand Aurelia Hotel, she saw the thing she had been circling without quite letting herself see it, that he had known this. From the fundraiser to the car, to the contract, to the library, he had known that what she was capable of was something his world could not have produced from inside itself. He had needed someone his world hadn't made. The problem was that his world was now the only world she was standing in. And somewhere across town, in room 412 of the Meridian Hotel, Preston Vale was sitting with Ronan Slate's people, and her voice was on a recording on his phone. And the auction was in 4 days, and everything. The land, the women, the foundation, the things she had not yet decided what to call between herself and the man standing across this desk. Everything was going to come. Everything was going to come down to 4 days. That was the number she kept returning to as Drum drove, and the city moved past the darkened windows in its wet November gray. 4 days between now and the Heron Point Foundation benefit at the Aldrich Waterfront Gallery. 4 days in which Ronan Slate had Preston Vale's information, Lyle's breach had already reached Helena Marsh, and the Delaware structure sat in a filing cabinet somewhere like a piece of ammunition nobody had fired yet, but everybody knew was loaded. She sat in the back of the sedan with a legal pad on her knee and wrote things down. Not in any organized structure. She was past organized structure, past the point where a list felt adequate to the situation. She wrote names and drew lines between them and crossed things out and rewrote them, and Cassian sat on the other side of the seat and watched her do it and did not interrupt. She was angry at him still. She was holding the anger in the specific compartment she'd built for it. Real, present, waiting for its moment. But she was not going to let it dictate the next 4 days because that was not something she could afford, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and neither of them had said anything about it since the library. Preston won't give us the documentation voluntarily, she said, not looking up from the legal pad. We established that. He's already with Slate's people. He's given them whatever I handed him on that call. She drew a line between Preston's name and a box she'd labeled recording. But he made a mistake. He's been making several, Cassian said. This specific one. She tapped the box. He told me about Claire Voth. He told me about the access point in Lyle's office. He didn't mean to. He was trying to demonstrate how thorough he'd been, how valuable his access had been, and he gave me the mechanism. She looked up. Claire Voth is not Slate's person. She's not Lyle's person. She was Preston's person. Personal connection, not operational. Which means Slate doesn't know she exists as an access point. Cassian was quiet, listening. If she has copies of what she passed to Preston, and she might, if she's careful, if she kept them for her own protection, then we have a chain of custody that doesn't go through Preston at all. She looked back at the legal pad. And if she knows that Preston is currently sitting in a hotel room with people who will cut her loose the moment she becomes inconvenient, she talks to us instead, Cassian said. She talks to Anita Voss, Maribel said. Independent counsel. Not you, not Drum, not anyone connected to Vey. Me and Anita, and Claire Voth decides on her own terms what she wants to do. She drew a line. That's today, tonight, if possible. I can get you her address in an hour. I need it in 20 minutes. Cassian reached for his phone. She went back to the legal pad. The auction was 4 days away. She needed 3 things before it. The documentation of Lyle's breach through Cowell and the Collier's dinner, which the photographs partially covered but which needed corroboration. The chain of custody for the beneficiary document, which Claire Voth might provide. And something she hadn't written down yet because writing it down made it real in a way she was still deciding how to handle. She needed to understand what Slate was actually planning to do at the auction, not generally. She could construct the general shape of it, a public disruption calibrated to damage the Foundation's credibility at its most visible moment. She needed the specific, the room, the timing, the mechanism. Because a general defense against a specific attack was not a defense, it was a hope. And she had spent enough of her life operating on hope to be done with it. She wrote specific on the legal pad and drew a box around it. The Meridian, she said. No, Cassian said. I need to know what Slate told Preston to do at the auction. I know what you need, he said. His voice was controlled. You are not going to the Meridian. She looked at him. Give me a reason that isn't about protecting me. He held her gaze. Because if Slate's people see you at that hotel, they know you've been identified as active in this situation, and they change the plan. Right now, you're a variable he hasn't mapped. You walk into that building, and you become a known quantity, and we lose the only advantage we have. She breathed. He was right. She hated that he was right. Then how do we get the specific? She said. Drum has a contact in Slate's logistics network, Cassian said. Low level, careful, has been useful before. I'll reach out tonight. That contact reports to Drum, she said. Who reports to you? Which means the information comes to me through 2 filters by the time I see it. Yes, I need it unfiltered. He was quiet for a moment. I'll put you in the room when the contact calls. She looked at him. It was a concession that cost him something. She could see that in the way people show the cost of things they don't want to show. The slight compression around his eyes that was not pain but was adjacent to it. Letting her be present for an operational call was not something he did. She understood that. She was asking him to change how he operated in real time, under pressure, while he was also managing a 15-year betrayal and a land deal on the edge of collapse. Tonight? She said. Tonight, he said. She went back to the legal pad. Outside, the city was beginning to thicken with the late afternoon traffic of people who had spent the day inside their normal lives and were now moving homeward. And she watched them through the dark window with the specific detachment of someone whose normal life had become, in the space of approximately 48 hours, entirely unrecognizable. Claire Voth was 27 and lived in a 4th-floor walk-up in the garment district and opened her door in paint-stained jeans with the wariness of someone who had been expecting a conversation like this one for longer than she'd admitted to herself. Maribel had come alone. No Drum, no car. She'd taken a cab and walked the last block. Anita Voss was on the phone rather than in person, available if needed, her number already open on Maribel's screen. I'm not here to threaten you, Maribel said, standing in the doorway. I'm here because you're going to need to make a decision before someone makes it for you. Claire let her in. The apartment was small and careful. The apartment of someone who organized the things within their control because the things outside it were in motion. There were plants everywhere, improbably alive, crowding every windowsill. Claire sat on the edge of her couch with her hands wrapped around a mug she'd already been holding when she answered the door. And she looked at Maribel with the eyes of someone deciding how much longer they could afford to be afraid. He told you about me, Claire said. He didn't mean to, Maribel said. She sat in the chair across from her. He was trying to impress me with his access. He mentioned your name in the context of Lyle's office, and I did the rest. She kept her voice level. Not warm. Warmth would be patronizing here. Just direct. How long have you been sitting on copies? Claire's hands tightened on the mug. I don't... Claire. She said the name with the same quality she'd used on the phone with Preston 3 days ago. Not unkind, but not soft either. The voice of someone who needed the conversation to skip the part where they pretended. The women in the Foundation's assistance program are going to be exposed in a public legal proceeding in 4 days if the documentation doesn't surface before then. I need what you have, handled through independent legal counsel, in a way that protects you. I am offering you that path right now. Silence. Claire looked at the plants on the windowsill for a long moment. Something moved through her face. Not guilt, specifically, but the expression of someone who had been holding something heavy for months and was trying to determine whether the person across from them was actually strong enough to take some of the weight. He said it was just financial information, Claire said. He called it a whistleblower situation. He said Lyle was defrauding the Foundation and he needed documentation to... I know what he said. He didn't tell me about the program. Her voice had gone tight. He did not tell me there were women's names in what I was... She stopped. I know, Maribel said. And she did. She believed her. It had the specific texture of truth. Not the smooth, constructed variety, but the rough, irregular kind that came with the particular shame of having been used by someone you trusted. She recognized it from the inside. You have copies, Maribel said. Claire looked at her. Then she stood, went to the kitchen, and came back with a manila envelope that she held for a moment before setting it on the coffee table between them. Maribel did not reach for it immediately. She looked at Claire. Call this number, she said, and held out her phone with Anita's contact open. Tell her what you have and how you got it. She'll tell you what your options are. I won't be in that conversation unless you want me to be. Claire looked at the phone. Then she took it. Maribel went to stand by the window while Claire talked, looking down at the street below, at the ordinary movement of a city that didn't know what was happening 4 floors above it. She could hear Claire's voice behind her, quiet at first, then steadier, the voice of someone finding solid ground under their feet. She looked at the plants crowding the windowsill. Improbably alive. She thought, me too. The call with Drum's contact came at 11 that night, in a back room of the estate that she had not been in before. A room that was clearly operational rather than residential, with screens on one wall showing building schematics and a table covered in documents that Drum had swept to one side when she entered. The contact's voice came through a scrambled line, flattened and slightly distorted, and she stood at the table with her legal pad and listened. The plan for the auction was not what she'd expected. It was worse. Slate was not planning a public disruption. He was not planning to file a legal challenge from the floor, or produce documents, or make a scene. He was planning something quieter and more surgical, a private conversation, in the gallery's back corridor during the event, with two of the Foundation's major donors. A conversation in which Slate's representative would present the Delaware structure documents and suggest, privately, that the donors' involvement in the assistance program might become part of the subsequent legal proceedings unless they withdrew their support from the Foundation publicly before the acquisition closed. It was a threat dressed as a warning. It was designed to make the donors feel they had a choice when the choice had already been made for them. And the representative Slate was sending was not one of his operational people. It was Preston. Because Preston knew the donors personally. Because Preston had attended the same events, sat at the same tables, worked the same charitable circuits for 5 years with Maribel at his side, and then without her. Because Preston's face in that room would be the face of someone familiar, someone trusted by proximity. And because that familiarity would do half the work before he opened his mouth. She stood at the table after the call ended, and she did not move for a full 30 seconds. Cassian was watching her. "He's going to use his access to me," she said. "Everything those donors know about Preston came through knowing me. Every dinner, every event, every time he was in the room with them." "I know," Cassian said. "He's going to trade on 5 years of my life to—" She stopped. The anger was out of its compartment now. She could feel it everywhere, not hot, not the kind that made you loud. The cold, total kind that settled into your bones and became something structural. "No. Maribel, no." She turned to face him fully. "I am going to be in that gallery. I am going to be in the room before Preston gets to those donors. And I am going to make sure that the last thing Preston Vale is able to trade on in that city is his proximity to me." Cassian looked at her. For once, he did not argue, did not produce the professional calm or the careful counterpoint. He looked at her with that expression she still didn't have a name for, the one that lived in the space between assessment and something warmer, and he said, "Then we have 4 days to make sure you're not walking in alone." She breathed. 4 days, she said. "We'll use them." They used them. Maribel spent the first day with Anita Voss and the documentation Claire Voth had produced. 3 months of copied files, organized with the instinctive carefulness of someone who had known, at some level, that the day would come when she would need them. The chain of custody was clean. The beneficiary document had Claire's copy stamp from Lyle's office on a date 13 days before the Colliers' dinner, which established that Preston had it before Cowell, which dismantled the version of events in which the leak was accidental or operational rather than deliberate and personal. The second day she spent learning the Aldrich Gallery. She walked through it twice, once in the afternoon as a member of the public, once in the evening during a set-up walkthrough that Cassian arranged through the Foundation's event coordinator. She mapped the rooms. She identified the back corridor where Slate's plan was set to unfold. She noted the sight lines, the entry points, the places where a conversation could happen without being seen, and the places where it couldn't. She noted the place on the main floor where she intended to be standing when Preston arrived. The third day she spent with Cassian. Not operational planning. They had done the operational planning, and Drum had his people placed, and the documentation was with Anita and with a journalist Maribel had contacted independently, a woman she'd worked with at a fundraising organization 3 years ago who was careful and thorough and had been waiting for a story with this kind of documentation for longer than Maribel had known it existed. The journalist was not going to publish before the auction. She was going to be present at it. The third day was something else. It was the day she and Cassian sat in the library. The same chairs, the same fire, and had the conversation she'd told him they were going to have. The real one. The one about what the arrangement actually was, and what she was actually doing in it, and what she was going to need from him going forward that was different from the contract's 12 pages. It was not an easy conversation. He was not easy to have it with. He was, she had established, a man who had constructed himself at some point in his past as someone who did not require things from people, who had decided that requiring things was the same as being vulnerable to them, and who had been living inside that construction for long enough that its walls had started to look like permanent landscape. She told him she could see the walls. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know." She said, "That's not enough." He looked at her. The fire was lower. The grounds outside were dark. "What is?" he said. She thought about it. She had been thinking about it for 3 days, through the legal pad and the gallery walk and the documents and the journalist. Beneath all of it, this question running like a bass note. What does she actually need from this man? And is it something he is capable of? And if it isn't, what does she do with that? "Honesty," she said. "Not the kind you use operationally, the other kind." She held his gaze. "I know that's harder for you than anything else I've asked." He breathed. "Once." "Yes," he said. It came out with the stripped quality. No professional layer, just the weight of the word itself. "Work on it," she said. He nodded. It was not a resolution. It was not a promise of one. It was what it was. Two people who had arrived at each other through a series of events that were neither clean nor simple, who had a thing between them that did not have a category yet, who were going to walk into a gallery in one day and stand in the wreckage of several people's decisions and see what was left standing. She went to bed on the third night and did not sleep well, but slept enough. And in the morning she dressed in the deep crimson dress she had selected on the first day. Not Cassian's selection, hers, from a shop in the city where she had walked in alone and stood in front of a mirror and chosen the thing that made her feel like herself. Not a self she was auditioning or managing or scaling back. Herself. The dress was the color of something decided. The Aldrich Waterfront Gallery was everything expensive events were. Good bones, calculated lighting, the specific smell of fresh flowers deployed in quantity against the underlying smell of money and ambition. It held 300 people on its main floor and more in the side galleries, and by 8 p.m. it was full, the foundation's benefit running at the exact temperature of its own success, the kind of event that produced large checks and careful photographs and the feeling, among its attendees, that they were participating in something worthwhile. Maribel arrived at 7:45. She arrived alone, which was a choice she had argued with Drum about for 20 minutes and won. Not because she needed to make a point about independence. She was past making points about independence. That was a conversation for people who still needed to prove something to themselves. She arrived alone because Preston needed to see her arrive alone. He needed to believe for as long as possible that she was here as a guest rather than as something else. She had barely crossed the threshold when she saw him. He was near the bar on the left side of the main floor, a glass of something amber in his hand, wearing the gray suit she had helped him pick out at a different event in a different life, and he was talking to a man she didn't recognize, 50s, unremarkable, the specific unremarkability of someone who had cultivated it. Not Slate. One of Slate's. Preston saw her. She watched his face do it. The sequence of responses in fast succession. Surprise, recalibration, a flash of something that might have been genuine feeling for a fraction of a second before the management arrived and covered it. He said something brief to the man beside him. The man's eyes moved to her, a quick professional assessment, and then moved away. She moved into the room. She was not going to the bar. She was not going to Preston. She was moving along the right side of the room toward the place she had identified on her second walkthrough, a position near the main gallery's east wall with a clear sight line to the back corridor, to the main entrance, and to the table where she knew the two donors in question were currently seated. She reached the wall. She picked up a glass of water from a passing tray. She looked at the room. It was all here. Everything that had been building since a chandelier at the Grand Aurelia Hotel had thrown its indiscriminate light across 200 people, and one man had decided to use a microphone. Lyle was here somewhere. She had not located him yet, but she would. The donors were here, seated, laughing at something their tablemate had said. The journalist was here, near the entrance with a press credential and a phone she was not visibly holding but which Maribel knew was recording. Drum's people were here, distributed across the room in the way that good security distributed itself. Present everywhere, visible nowhere. And Cassian was here. She found him across the room without looking for him. That was the strange thing. She had not had to scan for him. Her eyes had simply arrived at him the way eyes arrive at a familiar thing without being directed. He was near the Foundation's display, talking to someone she didn't know, and he was wearing the dark suit with no tie, collar open, the same clothes he'd worn in the car on the first night, and he had not yet seen her or was pretending he hadn't, which was itself a kind of message. She turned her attention back to the room. Preston was moving. She tracked him without looking directly at him, peripheral, careful, and she watched him separate from Slate's man and begin to navigate the room with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years working events like this, the specific social fluency of a man who understood that these rooms had their own grammar and had learned to speak it. He was heading toward the donors' table. She was moving before she'd consciously decided to move. She crossed the room on a diagonal, water glass in hand, cutting through a gap between two clusters of guests, and she arrived at the donors' table at the same moment Preston did, from the opposite direction, so that when he looked up, she was already there. Standing in a deep crimson dress, her shoulders back, her chin level, looking at the two women at the table, not at Preston, with the expression of someone who had come over to say hello to people she knew, which she did, which was the honest truth. She had met them both at 3 different Foundation events over the past 2 years, and they knew her face, if not her full name. "Margaret," she said. To the older of the two, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up into silver hair. "It's good to see you. I've been meaning to reach out." Margaret looked up with the smile of mild social recognition. "Of course, you were at the conservation dinner in October." "I was." She sat down in the empty chair beside Margaret without being invited, which was another choice. The choice of a woman who had decided some time ago that waiting for an invitation was for doors that were actually closed. She put her water glass on the table. "I actually wanted to talk to you about something, if you have a few minutes." Preston was standing at the table. He had not sat down. He was standing with his amber drink and his gray suit, and his face was doing the thing it did when the management was working hard, the controlled pleasantness of a man recalculating in real time. "Preston," she said, looking up at him. Directly, briefly, with the specific neutrality of someone acknowledging a thing that is present without assigning it significance. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Maribel." His voice was careful. "You look—" "I need to borrow Margaret for a few minutes," she said. Not to him, to the table. Then she looked back at Margaret. "There's something related to the Foundation's legal structure that I think you should hear before the evening gets further along." Margaret looked at her. Something in Maribel's voice had communicated what it needed to communicate. Not urgency in the dramatic sense, but the specific gravity of a woman who was not here socially. "Of course," Margaret said. Maribel stood. Margaret stood with her. Across the table, the second donor, a younger woman, early 40s, watching this with the sharp attentiveness of someone who had learned to read rooms, also stood. Preston took a step toward her. "Maribel," he said. The management was slipping. She could hear it. The pleasantness thinning at the edges, the controlled quality giving way to the tighter voice underneath. "We should talk first, you and me, before—" "No," she said. She said it the way she had said it in the library 3 days ago. Not loud, not hard, just final. The sound of a door that had closed completely and had no handle on his side. She moved away from the table with Margaret and the second donor. She heard Preston's breath, the sharp intake of a man watching something he'd planned for slide away from him in real time. She did not turn back. She was navigating toward the East Side Gallery, the smaller space, quieter, which she'd identified on the walkthrough as the place for this conversation. The place where she could talk to these women with privacy and without the ambient noise of 300 people. She heard it before she processed it. A sound wrong for the room. Not loud. Almost the opposite, a controlled sound, the sound of something happening with deliberate quiet behind the ambient noise. Near the back corridor. She turned her head. The back corridor door was open. She could see into it, 20 feet of service corridor, lighting one step down from the main gallery, and in it, 2 figures. She recognized one of them by posture before she registered the face. Drum. The second figure was Ronan Slate. Not a representative, not a logistics contact. Slate himself. She stopped walking. Margaret was still moving. Maribel put a hand briefly on her arm and said quietly, "One moment," and she turned fully toward the corridor. Slate had come himself. That was not what Drum's contact had said. The contact had said Preston, had said a representative, had said a quiet conversation with donors, had not said Slate, had not said the corridor, had not said tonight with this specific weight of presence. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Because Slate being here himself meant the plan was not what she'd been told it was. A man like Ronan Slate did not leave his operational distance to stand in a service corridor at a charity auction unless what was happening here was not the secondary move but the primary one. She turned to find Cassian. He was already moving toward the corridor. And that was when she saw what Cassian hadn't yet, what he couldn't see from his angle, from the other side of the room. The second man standing in the corridor's shadow, positioned between the corridor and the main gallery's emergency exit, his right hand at his side with the specific stillness of a hand that was not empty. Everything in the room sharpened. The sound of 300 people became very far away. Her heartbeat was in her ears, not fast. She was surprised by this, that her heart rate had not spiked, that her body had gone to the cold, focused place rather than the panicked one. And she was in motion before she'd finished the thought, moving on a diagonal that would put her between Cassian and the exit, between him and the man with the hand that was not empty. She had no plan. She had something better. She had the knowledge that she was the variable nobody had mapped, that she was the woman in the crimson dress who had not been in this world long enough to be anticipated by it, and that she was walking toward the most dangerous moment of her life with nothing but herself. That was what she had. She covered the distance in 8 steps, and she covered it fast enough that the man near the emergency exit did not have time to recalculate. He had been watching Cassian, the known quantity, the anticipated threat, the one his positioning had been designed around. He had not been watching the woman in the crimson dress who was moving on a diagonal from the East Gallery with the specific velocity of someone who had already decided what she was going to do before she fully understood what it was. She put herself between Cassian and the exit, not behind cover, not at an angle. Between, directly, physically, in the open space of the main gallery with the chandelier overhead, and 300 people behind her and the man's hand still at his side and his eyes now on her because she was impossible to ignore. And she held his gaze and she said, loudly enough that the nearest cluster of guests turned, loudly enough that the sound carried above the ambient noise of the event, in a way that could not be walked back or explained away as nothing. His name is Daryl Mitch. He works logistics for Ronan Slate, and he is currently carrying a concealed firearm in a gallery with 300 people. The room changed. Not chaos, not yet, not the running and screaming kind, because the words had hit people faster than the understanding of them. And there was a beat of collective suspension, that fraction of a second where 300 people were all processing the same words at the same moment, and none of them had gotten there yet. Mitch moved, not toward her, away. Toward the exit, the calculation of a man who understood that the window had closed, and that exposure was now the primary risk. He hit the emergency exit bar, and the alarm went off, and the sound broke the suspension, and then the room was moving. And in the corridor, Drum had Slate by the arm, and Cassian was already at the exit before it had fully swung open, and she could hear footsteps, and she stood in the place where she had planted herself, and she breathed. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them. Both of them, held out in front of her in the chandelier light, trembling with the specific fine tremor of a body that had held itself together through something and was now, with the immediate threat receding, beginning to process the cost of that. She pressed them flat against her thighs and looked up. Margaret was standing 10 feet away, the second donor beside her, both of them looking at Maribel with expressions she didn't have time to read. The journalist was already moving through the crowd toward the exit, phone up. Around the room, the guests were doing what people do when something frightening has happened in a place designed for safety. Clustering, talking, checking their own reactions against the reactions of the people nearest them. A hand on her arm. She turned. It was not Cassian. It was Drum, who had come back from the corridor with the compressed efficiency of someone who had done what needed to be done and returned to the next task. His face was its usual compact, unreadable surface, but his hand on her arm was careful. The grip of someone steadying rather than directing. Slate is contained, he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. Cassian's people have the exit. Mitch is gone, but there's a unit outside. He looked at her steadily. You all right? No, she said, honestly. But I'm standing. He nodded once. The nod of a man for whom that distinction between all right and standing was not a small one. Preston is in the East Gallery, he said. He saw what happened. He hasn't moved. She looked toward the East Gallery entrance. Through the open doorway, she could see the smaller room, its quieter crowd, and near the far wall, the gray suit and the face she had spent 5 years memorizing and was now seeing across a room for what she already knew would be the last real time. Preston was looking at her. He was standing with his drink still in his hand, forgotten, the amber liquid tilted to the edge of the glass, but not spilling, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before. Not the management, not the relief, not the specific performance he had run in that ballroom 10 days ago with a microphone and 200 witnesses. He looked afraid, not of her specifically, of the room, of the shape of what had just happened, of the walls closing in from every direction, of the specific sensation that arrives when a person realizes that the gamble they made has come up against something they did not factor into their calculations. She walked toward him. She walked through the East Gallery entrance and the sound of the main room dropped, and she crossed the smaller space, and she stopped in front of him and they looked at each other, and she thought about the last time they had been at this distance and what had been in his hand then and what he had said into it. "It's over," she said. He breathed. "Maribel." "Preston." She said his name the way she'd said it on the phone, quietly. Finally. "It's over. Slate is contained. The documentation is already with a journalist and with independent legal counsel. Whatever you were going to do tonight, it's done." She held his gaze. "You can talk to Anita Voss and tell her everything you know, which is the only option that leaves you with anything resembling a life on the other side of this. Or you can make a different choice, but I am not going to stand here and negotiate with you." He looked at her for a long time. His face was doing the thing it did when the architecture he'd built around himself was failing its structural load. She recognized it. She had seen it twice now, at the altar and in the East Gallery, and she understood it for what it was. Not cruelty, not malice in its pure form, but the expression of a man who had built himself out of the wrong materials and was watching the building come down. She almost felt sorry for him. "Not enough to stay. Call Anita," she said. "Tonight." She turned and walked back into the main gallery and did not look back, which was not dramatic and was not performance. It was simply the only direction she had left. The police arrived at 11 minutes past 8. The aftermath of those 11 minutes had the quality of all aftermaths. The specific organizational chaos of a situation that had resolved its peak tension and was now processing its consequences, which was less cinematic than the peak, but required more of the people inside it. Drum coordinated with the building's security and then with the officers. Cassian spoke to no one from law enforcement directly, which was a deliberate choice that Maribel understood and did not comment on. The journalist spoke to Margaret and the second donor, whose name, Maribel had learned in the East Gallery, was Renata, and both women were calm and specific, and said what they had to say with the precision of people who had decided what their role in this was. Maribel gave a statement to a detective named Hires, who had the exhausted attentiveness of someone working late on a night that had already been long. She told him about the man at the exit, the name she'd given, the concealed firearm. She told him what she'd heard from a contact regarding Slate's planned presence at the event. She did not tell him everything. She told him the parts that were hers to tell, the parts that did not require disclosing things that were drums or Cassians or clairvoyants to disclose in their own time and their own way. Hares wrote things down and looked at her with the expression of a man who understood he was getting a partial picture and had decided that the partial picture was sufficient for tonight. "You'll be available for follow-up," he said. Not a question. "Through my counsel," she said. "Anita Voss. I'll give you her number." He wrote the number. He left. She was sitting in one of the gallery's side chairs, heels off, the crimson dress slightly less composed than it had been at 7:45, when Cassian came and sat down across from her. He had been outside. She could tell from the temperature he brought with him, the cold off his jacket, the slight redness at the edges of his jaw from the night air. He looked at her. "Mitch," he said, "did they get him?" "Yes," she breathed. "Slate. Detained. There'll be a legal process." He said it with the specific flatness of someone who understood what legal processes involving men like Slate looked like. and was not going to perform optimism about it. It's going to be slow, and it's going to be fought at every level. But the exposure is real. His people know it. The acquisition closes in 8 days. He held her gaze. The Delaware structure is being dissolved, tonight, by my attorney, with documentation that I'm filing personally with the land trust. She looked at him. The shell never served the purpose it was built for anymore, he said. It became a liability the moment Lyle found it, and the moment I decided, he stopped. It should have been dissolved years ago. I kept it because I don't dissolve things easily. He said it with the self-knowledge of a man who had been sitting with something for 3 days and had arrived, slowly, at the truth of it. It's a thing about me, I know. I know, she said. The foundation, he said. The acquisition proceeds as a genuine conservation acquisition. Full stop. The development covenant is void with the shell dissolution, whatever it might have become. He looked at her steadily. It becomes what it was supposed to be. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him, at the specific quality of his face in this moment, stripped of everything except what was actually there, which was not simple and was not clean, but was, she had come to understand, real. The way difficult things were real. The way things that had cost something to arrive at were real. Warren Lyle, she said. Cassian's jaw moved. He came to me after Slate was detained, before the police arrived. He looked at the floor for a moment. He said he was sorry. What did you say? I said I know. He looked back up. The same words he'd used in the library, in the different context, the same stripped honesty. 15 years. He made a choice, and the choice was wrong in the way it was executed regardless of what he found underneath it. And He stopped, started again. I should have dissolved the shell years ago. That's true, whether or not Lyle found it. She looked at him. He's resigning from the board, Cassian said. It's the right thing. I didn't ask him to. She nodded. She picked up her heels from the floor beside the chair, held them in one hand, the straps looped over her fingers, and looked at the gallery around them. Emptying now, the guests long gone, the cleanup staff beginning their work, the flowers beginning to show their fatigue after an evening of standing at attention. The chandelier in the main room was still lit, doing what chandeliers did, throwing its democratic light across everything with the same indifference it had shown the Grand Aurelia Hotel 10 days ago. 10 days. She thought about the woman who had walked into the Grand Aurelia Hotel 10 days ago in $4,000 of ivory satin, gripping her bouquet so hard the stems bent, trying to believe that the object could anchor something that needed anchoring. She did not feel sorry for that woman. That was the thing she was most certain of, sitting in the aftermath of the Aldrich Gallery in bare feet with her heels in her hand. She did not feel sorry for her. That woman had made the best decision she could with the information she had. She had shown up. She had stayed in the room when everything in her wanted to find an exit. She had paid for the dress and worn it and walked down the aisle and taken what came. And when what came was unspeakable, she had not screamed and had not begged and had picked up her feet and walked out. And she had gotten into the car. That woman had gotten into the car. And here was where the car had gone. And here she was, sitting in it. Maribel, Cassian said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that expression she had finally found a word for, sometime in the last 4 days. In the space between the legal pad and the gallery walkthrough and the third day's conversation in the library. It was not warmth, not exactly, though it was adjacent to warmth. It was the expression of a man who had spent a long time believing that the people around him were variables and had encountered, unexpectedly, someone who declined to be a variable, someone who was instead a constant, the kind of constant you had to keep accounting for, that showed up in every calculation, that you couldn't set aside or subtract out. She had a word for it now. Recognition. He recognized her. Not the version of her that Preston Vale had tried to curate. Not the version she'd spent years managing and scaling back and apologizing for. The actual version. The woman who took up the space she took up and sat in chairs without being invited and ate everything on the tray without apology and put herself between danger and the people she had decided to protect. Tell me one true thing, she said. No strategy, no operational context, one true thing. He held her gaze for a long moment. The gallery was quiet around them. The cleanup staff had moved to the main room. A flower arrangement nearby had finally given up on one of its stems, which had bowed slowly to the table, graceful in its surrender. "I stopped the car because of who you were," he said. "Not because of what you could do, because of who you were, standing in the rain, with everything that had just happened to you, making a decision instead of having one made for you." He breathed, and I told myself it was operational because I did not have because it was simpler to tell myself it was operational. She looked at him. "That's the true thing," he said. She sat with it. Outside the gallery's tall windows, the waterfront was dark and cold, the sound moving in the distance with its ancient indifference, the lights of the far shore reflecting in the water in long, broken lines. Somewhere in this city, Ronan slate was being processed through a system that would move slowly and be fought at every level. Somewhere, Preston Vale was sitting in whatever room he had chosen to sit in, with a phone and Anita Voss's number and a decision he'd been given and would either make or not. Somewhere, Claire Voth was sleeping, maybe, with the specific sleep of someone who had set down something heavy and was still learning how their body felt without it. And somewhere, Warren Lyle was sitting with 15 years of a relationship and the specific grief of a man who had made a choice he had convinced himself was right and had discovered, in the process of making it, that conviction and correctness were not the same thing. She breathed. "The contract," she said. Cassian was still. "The termination clause," she said. "The one Anita rewrote." She looked at him. "I'm not invoking it. I want you to know that clearly and without ambiguity. I am not leaving." She held his gaze. "But I need the contract to change." "How?" he said. "It needs to reflect what this actually is," she said. "Not the original transaction, not the arrangement we walked into 10 days ago. What it actually is now, which is something neither of us planned for and both of us are going to have to be honest about." She looked at him steadily. "The 12 pages were for a different situation. We are in a different situation." He was quiet. "I know that's harder for you than closing a land acquisition," she said. Something moved in his face. The closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. Not a full one, nothing as available as that, but the movement of a face that had been arranged in control for a very long time, encountering something that made control feel, briefly, like the wrong tool. "Yes," he said. "It is." "Work on it," she said. It was what she had said 3 days ago in the library, and she said it the same way now, with the same weight and the same meaning, which was, "I am not asking you to be someone you aren't. I am asking you to be more of who you already are." He nodded. Well, the weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing that followed was simple, which was something she came to understand as a feature rather than a failure. The simplicity she had been chasing in the years with Preston had not been peace, she understood now. It had been the controlled absence of complication, which was different, which required a constant expenditure of energy to maintain. The energy of a person managing their own edges so that nothing got too sharp, nothing took up too much room, nothing became too much. She stopped managing her edges. Preston called Anita Voss the morning after the auction. He told her everything he knew about Slate's operation, about Lyle's files, about Claire Voth, about the logistics contact who had fed Drum the partial information that had turned out to be a partial picture because it had been fed deliberately to construct that partial picture. He told her about the cash arrangement in March. He cooperated fully, which was the only option he had left, and which cost him considerably. His consulting contracts, his social position, the careful scaffolding of a life built on proximity to money and credibility he hadn't earned. He was not arrested. He was reduced, which she came to believe was more accurate. She did not feel satisfied by his reduction. She had expected to. She had imagined in the weeks before the auction that watching Preston Vale's constructed life come apart would provide something, closure, vindication, the specific satisfaction of a wound that had healed correctly. What she felt instead was the absence of feeling, not numbness, the active, quiet absence of something that had been taking up significant interior space and was simply no longer there. The space was available now for other things. She used it. She took the foundation work seriously, not as Cassian's wife, not as an appendage to his operation, but as her own work, with her own purpose in it. The domestic assistance program needed restructuring after the events of November, The exposure of the beneficiary list, even without public disclosure, had made the program's privacy architecture inadequate, and she spent 6 weeks working with a legal team to rebuild it from the structural level up. She sat in rooms where people discussed the kind of damage that a name in the wrong document could do to a person who had already been damaged, and she sat in those rooms with the specific seriousness of someone who understood the subject not abstractly, but from the inside out. Margaret and Renata remained foundation donors. They had asked, after the auction, to understand the full picture, not the managed version, not the careful public statement that the foundation's PR produced, but the actual picture. Maribel had told them. All of it, including the Delaware structure and what it had been and what it had become and how it was being resolved. They had listened. They had stayed. She respected them enormously for both. Lyle resigned in December. She saw him once, at a function in January, and they did not speak, but he looked at her across a room with the expression of a man who had looked at himself in an honest mirror and had not looked away from what he found there. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it, the way she filed things, and moved on. The acquisition closed on a Wednesday in the second week of December, in a room with lawyers and documents, and the specific silence of a thing that had been building for a long time, arriving at its legal conclusion. The Heron Point parcel became, genuinely and completely, a conservation acquisition. No covenants, no secondary structures, no architecture underneath the stated purpose. Just the land and the water and the old trees and the walking trails that were planned and the foundation's name on a deed that said what it said without anything concealed beneath it. She stood outside the building after the closing and looked at the gray winter sky and thought about 42 acres of waterfront and the women who had trusted the foundation's word and deserved to have that trust be worth something. It was worth something. That was not nothing. She had learned to hold things like that. Not triumphant, not simple, but real. Real was enough. In February, 4 months after the night at the Grand Aurelia Hotel, Maribel returned to it, not for a wedding, not for an event. The foundation used the hotel's conference facilities periodically, and there was a board meeting scheduled, and she arrived in the lobby at 9 in the morning in a dark wool coat and heeled boots, and looked up at the chandelier. The same one, still throwing its indiscriminate light across everything with the same democratic indifference. And she thought, you don't know what you're looking at. The marble floor had no ring on it. Of course it didn't. Hotels cleaned their marble. But she knew where it had fallen, which tile, which exact spot, and she stood for a moment in that spot and breathed and felt the full 4 months of what had happened since that night move through her in the specific way of a thing you are finally ready to feel completely. Then she walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the conference floor and stood straight. The board meeting was 3 hours. She ran it efficiently, moved through the agenda with the practiced focus of someone who had learned in the last 4 months that she was considerably better at this than she had been given the opportunity to discover. And she closed it exactly on time and stood at the head of the table while the board members gathered their things, and she thought, this is what too much looks like. This is what it looks like when it is not managed and not apologized for and not scaled back for the comfort of a room that will adjust to it whether it chooses to or not. She walked back through the lobby on her way out. The chandelier. She did not look up at it this time. She walked out through the front door, down the steps where the peonies had scattered in the rain, and into the pale February light. Cassian was at the bottom of the steps. He was not there as theater. She knew him well enough now to know the difference between gesture and presence. And this was presence. The simple fact of a man who had checked her schedule and decided to be where she was. Not to manage anything or escort anything, just to be there. He was in the dark coat, collar open despite the cold, and he was looking at her with the expression that had become familiar. The recognition, the recalibrated assessment, the thing underneath it that was warmer than he knew how to name, but was no longer something he was refusing to show. How was it? He said. Good, she said. She reached the bottom of the steps and stood in front of him. It was good. He held out his hand. It was a simple thing. An open hand, offered without ceremony, without anything attached to it in the way of performance or statement. Just his hand in the February air extended toward her, and the specific quality of the gesture that said, I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and I know that is not enough, but it is what I have, and I am giving it to you without strategy. She looked at his hand. She thought about 10 days ago, about 4 months ago, about the ring falling through the air and the sound it made on the marble and the rain and the car and the library and the corridor and the gallery and the crimson dress. She thought about the women in the program and the 42 acres of waterfront and the old trees and the honest deed. She thought about what she had eaten for breakfast that morning without apologizing for it. She thought about the space that had opened up inside her when she stopped managing her edges, and what she had put in it, and how it felt to have things in it that were actually hers. She thought about the word too much and the specific quiet death of its power over her. Then she took his hand, not because she needed it, not because she was being rescued, not because the story required it, not because standing at the bottom of the steps of the Grand Aurelia Hotel in February required a symmetry with the night that had started everything. She took it because she chose to take it, because the choosing was the point, and had always been the point, and because the man whose hand it was had done the slow, uncomfortable work of becoming someone whose hand was worth taking. They stood there for a moment at the bottom of the steps. Around them, the city moved in its ordinary February way. People with their ordinary destinations and their ordinary purposes. The traffic and the cold and the sound of the harbor somewhere behind the buildings, and the pale light doing what winter light did, hitting everything at a low angle that made even familiar things cast long shadows. "Come on," she said. They walked. Not back into the hotel, not into the car. They walked together into the street, and the city received them the way cities receive everyone, without ceremony, without recognition, with the vast democratic indifference of a place that has seen everything and is still here regardless. She had been abandoned at the altar for being too much. She had returned as herself, fully, without apology, without architecture designed to make herself smaller. And the man walking beside her had watched her do it, and had learned slowly and with some difficulty that the right response to a woman who knew her own worth was not to try to measure it, but to show up, hand extended, and let her decide. She had decided. The city stretched out ahead of them in the February cold. No one watched. No one needed to.